Understanding Mercury in the first house would be rather easy and natural and fluid if we just brush up first on what the first house represents and what Mercury represents. So here's the first house. It's the area of the sky associated with the eastern horizon. The eastern horizon is where the sun rises, and the sunrise is the basis for everything that the first house represents. The sunrise is the beginning of the day, and the sunrise brings things to visibility. So, because it's the beginning of the day, the sunrise represents the beginning of the life, the birth, the thing which is produced by the birth, the body, and the person that inhabits and occupies and uses the body, the self. Because sunrise brings things to visibility, the first house represents manifestation, bringing things to visibility, making things tangible things, visible things. And therefore it also represents your traits, tangible, visible, manifest things about yourself, your appearance, your character, your skills, your strengths, your weaknesses, and so forth. So that wasn't too hard. Let's do a similar brush up on what Mercury represents. Mercury basically symbolizes intelligence. And intelligence does two things. It deals with codes and patterns. Because intellect deals with codes, Mercury signifies communication. Communication is the act of encoding an idea in some format that can be expressed or shared with other people. And communication also has to do with decoding the information that has been shared with you. Communication is basically saying interaction, so Mercury symbolizes interaction. And also this includes interactions like exchanging things, not just ideas, but exchanging things. So Mercury impacts trade as well. Interaction is done amongst people with whom you're related, so Mercury represents relationships, especially friendships or peers, people with whom you just freely exchange things in both directions. It's not a one-way exchange from a superior to an inferior. And being friendly, Mercury, therefore, is kind of fun, so it represents recreation. Mercury is witty, Mercury tells good jokes, Mercury is funny, Mercury is fun, Mercury is youthful, Mercury is friendly. Now, in order to put things into codes and decode things that are coded, one has to recognize patterns. So intellect has all to do with recognition of patterns, and therefore Mercury represents learning, because learning means figuring out how to interpret a pattern. Mercury also represents organization, because organization means efficiency and how you deal with patterns and the ability to put things into good patterns. So Mercury, therefore, is also very neat. Neatness is another aspect of organized. If you're very organized and efficient, then your patterns have symmetry. And so Mercury represents symmetry, patterns matching other patterns, which affects our beauty and our appearance, and also affects our balance. Physical balance as well as emotional balance, mental balance, intellectual balance. Because of having to do with balance, Mercury therefore represents dexterity, which is again not just physical dexterity, but also intellectual dexterity or expertise. Now that we've brushed up on what Mercury symbolizes and what the first house symbolizes, as I promised, it should be pretty natural or fluid or easy to interpret what Mercury means when it's in the first house. All that we need to do is put the two symbolic trees side by side and see what links between them. For example, Mercury has to do with beauty and the first house has to do with appearance. So because this is a link between the planet and the house it occupies, it's something very important to interpret to understand the planet and the house. Mercury is the planet of expertise, and the first is the house of skills. So that's another seed that will grow into an interpretation of Mercury in the first house. And the third is that Mercury is the planet of relationships, but the first house is self. So once you've identified the links between the planet and the house, your next task is to figure out what those links mean. If you're good with intuition, it should be almost obvious already, but it's always good to go through the steps anyway, because you discover extra things that you didn't initially think about. So let's do that now. The first seed is that Mercury is the planet of beauty, and the first house is the house of appearance. What does this mean? People with Mercury in the first house, they're very visual. They're appearance oriented. They know how to make a good appearance. They're good looking. They're clean. So for example, many painters, sculptors, designers, models have Mercury in the first house. A few examples are Frida Kahlo, the painter, both the Versace's Gianni and Donatella, the model Gigi Hadid, and the model Candy Bar. People that are good looking make a living out of looks, or people who create art. Another seed about Mercury in the first house is that Mercury is the planet of expertise, and the first is the house of skills. So what grows from this seed? Well, a person with Mercury in the first house is probably sophisticated. They have expertise, they're skillful, they're refined, they're talented. So many writers, many poets, many musicians have Mercury in the first house. T.S. Eliot, George Lucas, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Andrea Bocelli, to name a very few. And the third seed of Mercury in the first house is that Mercury is the planet of relationships, and the first house is the house of the self. So they're connecting, but not necessarily in the most easy way. So how do you interpret this? How do you grow this seed into an interpretation? People with Mercury in the first house, they have an adjustable self. So that can be very good if you can get into acting, but it can also be very good if you can get into negotiations, diplomacy, and cooperation. Things that require cooperation or facilitating cooperation. It can also be a little bit difficult if you're looking for a clearly defined anchor sense of who you definitely are. So many actors have Mercury in the first house. Many actors and actresses. For example, Goldie Hawn, Paul Newman, Danny DeVito, Matt Dillon, Tom Selleck, and Leonardo DiCaprio. So these are the basic ways that the seeds grow into interpretations for Mercury in the first house. But just as the same seed would grow differently in different soil, similarly, the same placement like Mercury in the first house actually works differently in different signs and in different conjunctions and aspects in different charts. These people that we mentioned in this video as exemplary of Mercury in the first house, they are who they are, not just because they have Mercury in the first house, but because of how their whole chart synergizes with Mercury in the first house. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. Mercury in the second house is a great thing. At least I really like it. It's one of my favorite placements for Mercury. And I want to mention that if you have Mercury in the second whole sign house at a degree which is very similar to the degree of your ascendant, then you should also be interpreting Mercury in the 8th house as well, because Mercury will be strongly influencing the 8th house. So you should consider that in conjunction with what we're going to talk about in today's video. And conversely, if you have Mercury in the 8th whole sign house, close to the same degree as your ascendant, then you should be utilizing what we're going to discuss in this video, Mercury in the 2nd house, to understand your Mercury in the 8th. So let's start understanding Mercury in the 2nd by reviewing what the 2nd house signifies. As you can see, it is the portion of the sky that's below the eastern horizon directly. And so it's like supporting the eastern horizon, and therefore all of its symbolism has to do with supporting what the sunrise symbolizes. The sunrise symbolizes starting things and making things visible. So the 2nd house is pro-starting and pro-visibility. So this is why it is the house of foundations. Foundations allow you to build something. So foundations are pro-starting. And it's all about the things that foundation signifies, like stability. The foundation of you is your parents and your grandparents, etc., right? So that's why the 2nd house signifies your family, as well as all the people who are supporting you and holding you up, your friends, etc. And another thing that supports you is all of your wealth. And by wealth, we don't just mean your paper money, but we mean all the things that you subsist upon, like your food and your shelter and so forth. So the 2nd house signifies all of that. Since the 2nd house is pro-visibility, it symbolizes knowledge, because knowledge makes things known or visible. So not only does it signify knowledge, but it signifies making things known. So expressing things, speaking things, and having a voice. Furthermore, pro-visibility also implies realism, practicality, and tangibility. So we're well on our way to understanding Mercury in the 2nd house, because now at least we understand the 2nd house. But let's also take one more little pit stop to understand what Mercury itself symbolizes. Mercury fundamentally represents intellect, and that means that it's dealing with codes and patterns. This is why it's the planet of communication and languages and symbols, because those are the ways that we encode information. And what do we do with communication and language and so forth? We interact. So Mercury signifies interaction. And that also has a ramification that puts Mercury in touch with business, exchange, trade, selling, buying. Furthermore, it also makes Mercury very relevant to your relationships, the people that you interact with. And so Mercury is a planet that signifies relationships and friendships. And since it's friendly, it has to do with friendly things like recreation. So Mercury is a very relaxed, fun, youthful planet. Because intellect has to do with patterns, Mercury symbolizes learning, which means recognizing patterns. And intellect is not just about recognizing patterns, but it's also about forming patterns, putting things into patterns, and hence Mercury represents organization, being very patterned, being very efficient, being very neat. And that is why Mercury symbolizes symmetry, balance, and beauty. And that in turn is why Mercury symbolizes dexterity, balance, dexterity, expertise. So far, so good. We are really ready to understand Mercury in the 2nd house. Now, all we need to do is put what we know about Mercury next to what we know about the 2nd house and see where things link up. For example, Mercury signifies speech, and the 2nd house signifies speech. So if you have Mercury in the 2nd house, it's very important that we can give some kind of interpretation about speech. Exactly what interpretation? We'll talk about that next. But right now, we've identified the seed of what we need to focus on. Another example is that Mercury signifies learning, and the 2nd house also signifies learning. It signifies knowledge. Thirdly, Mercury signifies friendship, and the second house signifies friends. See what I mean about linking up? The symbolism between the planet and the house linking up. So this is the third seed, and there's actually two other seeds that I'll mention in a bit. But let's take a look at how these seeds would grow into more fleshed out interpretations. Okay, so the first seed of Mercury in the second house is speech, right? Mercury represents speech, and so does the second house. So what do you expect? A person with Mercury in the second house is linguistic. They're a linguist. They're good with words. They're good with expression and communication. So, for example, there's a lot of writers and comedians, very famous comedians, with Mercury in the second house. John Belushi, Steve Martin, Gene Wilder, and the author Frank Herbert. Linguists, people who are excellent with words. Comedy is all about words and the duplicity, the ironic duplicity of meaning. The second seed of Mercury in the second house was that Mercury signifies learning and the second house signifies knowledge. So it's basically the same. So how do you interpret that? It's not that difficult. The person with Mercury in the second house is intelligent. Specifically, they're probably a quick learner. Things are revealed to them easily. They detect the pattern right away. So think about the people that we just named. They're all quite intelligent, but now also some really, really intellectual, important people. J.B. Dumas, the chemist, Felix Bloch, and L.W. Alvarez, the physicist, and T.W. Adorno, the philosopher. The third thing about Mercury in the second house is that Mercury signifies friendship, and the second house signifies friends. So a person with Mercury in the second house is probably friendly. They're relatable. You know what they're feeling, you know what they're saying, and similarly, it's easy for them to identify with you, so they're sympathetic or empathetic. Now, I mentioned there are two other seeds. There's a lot of seeds, really good seeds that come up with Mercury in the second house, and there's two more than usual. Mercury signifies beauty, and the second house signifies health. So Mercury in the second house indicates a person who's beautiful, especially in the face, because the second house in anatomy is especially relevant to the face. Also, this implies a person who's health conscious and is interested in having a balanced diet, because beauty is attained through health, and Mercury attains health through balance. And the second house signifies diet. So that's one additional thing. And a second additional thing is that Mercury signifies trade, and the second house signifies wealth. So people with Mercury in the second house probably have pretty good luck with money, but particularly they're intelligent about money, which means that they can usually make money by doing what they want, by doing what they have curiosity for, by doing what they have interest in, instead of just working for other people at things that they don't really like. So this is how we flesh out the seeds of Mercury's interpretations into more tangible forms. But remember that seeds grow differently in different soils and under different conditions. So the people that I've mentioned here in this video, for example, are who they are because of how the entire condition of their whole chart synergized with their Mercury in the second house. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have two groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. Mercury in the third house is a placement that a lot of people find confusing or really interesting. So in this video, let's clarify and make it very simple and clear what it really means. And before starting, I just want to note that if you have Mercury in the third sign from your ascendant at a degree which is very similar to your ascendant's degree, then that Mercury will be having a lot of influence on your ninth house. So you would also want to consider the interpretations of Mercury in your ninth house as overtones. And conversely, if your Mercury is in the ninth sign from your ascendant at about the ascendant's degree, it will have a lot of effect on your third house. And so you will want to consider the interpretations that we're going to discuss in this video. In order to understand Mercury in the third house, let's start by understanding the third house. As you can see here, the third house is the part of the sky that is deep underground, but on the eastern side of it. And since it's part of the deeply underground sky, it signifies all the things that are deeply internal to our being, our feelings, our emotions. But since it's on the eastern side, it also signifies things pertaining to the self and things pertaining to physicality and tangibility. So when you put two and two together, you understand the root of what the third house symbolizes. It symbolizes the feelings that we have towards ourself. So that involves two things. It involves our self-motivation, the things that motivate us, and it involves the way that we are able to express ourselves tangibly, to make our internal concepts or motives realized and real. So, to be specific, the third house represents decision making, because the decision is the basis of the motivation. You decide that you want something, or you decide that you don't want something, you decide that something is good or bad, etc. And this implies two other very important things about the third house: confidence and independence. When you make your own decisions, you're independent. And when you make your own decisions, you have a lot of confidence in yourself. The third house also symbolizes our ambitions, the things that motivate us, the things that drive us, our hungers, our lusts, what we want. The third house also symbolizes self-focus, which has a spectrum between selfishness on the one side and self-worth and self-love on the other side. All of those things are impacted directly and strongly by the third house. Now, about the way the third house represents how we express our inner self, the third house represents strength, which is the ability to influence the external reality. The third house represents physical strength for sure, and it also represents strength in terms of commitment to decisions. So the third house also has a lot to say about whether or not you're focused or distracted. The third house has to do with your skills, your expertise, your talents, your ability to express accurately and effectively what you're thinking, what you're feeling. And finally, the third house has to do with contest, because it has to do with self, right? It's what's motivating the self. So when you put a bunch of self-motivated people together, they conflict with each other. So third house has to do with contest, and the people with whom we contest are equals, our peers, our siblings. So we want to understand Mercury in this third house, and we're almost ready to do that. But first, we should really just take a second to make sure we understand what Mercury symbolizes. The fundamental basis of everything that Mercury symbolizes is intellect. And intellect processes codes into patterns. So Mercury signifies communication, and it deals with languages and even numeric languages, any kind of language system, because language is the encoding of thoughts, feelings, ideas. Mercury symbolizes interaction because that's what you do with language. You communicate, you interact. But also you interact and exchange with money. So Mercury signifies mercantilism, exchanging, trade, etc., being a merchant. Mercury therefore has to do with relationships between the parties. So it has to do with friendships and partnerships. And since Mercury has to do with friendship and relationship, it's therefore friendly, and it signifies friendly things, things that are easy, things that are agreeable. So it has to do with wit, relaxation, recreation, fun, youthfulness. Mercury, of course, is the planet that represents learning, because learning is simply the recognition and understanding of the patterns that you encounter in life. Mercury symbolizes organization, because organization means the ability to put things into efficient and effective patterns. That's why Mercury symbolizes neatness and cleanness. Mercury symbolizes symmetry, because symmetry is organization of things into good patterns. And because it signifies symmetry, it has to do with balance, equanimity, and also beauty. Mercury finally signifies dexterity and expertise because it signifies the ability to achieve balance. Now, good job. You've fulfilled all of your prereqs and you're ready to enroll in the course on Mercury in the third house. How are we going to work this out? What does Mercury symbolize when it's in the third house? It's really simple now that we remember what Mercury symbolizes and what the third house symbolizes. All we have to do is put the two symbolisms next to each other and see where they link up, what they have in common. The most significant and fundamental link between Mercury and the third house is a confusing one, and this is why I opened the video by saying a lot of people are kind of confused about what Mercury in the third house represents, because Mercury is a balanced, symmetrical, neuter planet, gender neutral, whereas the third house is decisively masculine. So, the various things that Mercury represents will often not seem to go well with the various things that the third house represents. For example, Mercury represents finesse, dexterity, right? Whereas the third house represents forcefulness and strength. So finesse doesn't really seem to get along with force. Mercury signifies balance and equanimity, but the third house represents lust and decisive dedication. So the third house is very heavily biased towards and against things, what it likes and wants and what it doesn't like and doesn't want, whereas Mercury is very middling. And finally, Mercury is very friendly and easygoing. It likes to have recreation. But the third house is very driven and motivated, so it likes to have discipline. So these topics are going to interact in a kind of contentious way, and we're going to want to interpret that. But for now, it's enough to have just identified that these are the issues that are going on with Mercury sitting in the third house. We'll talk more about that in a second, but let's look at two other issues. These other ones are quite good, actually. So Mercury represents dexterity or expertise, and the third house represents skill or expertise. So that gets along really well. That links up really well. We'll want to think about that as well. And finally, Mercury has to do with friendship, right? Relationships, and the third house has to do with friends, because it has to do with the peers, potential friends, and siblings. So after you identify the real pulse or root or seed of what's going on with the planet in the house, then you can take more time to try to explore how that seed would grow and how you would interpret that seed. So let's first of all look at this pretty complex and deep one about Mercury being neuter and the third house being masculine. The way that this is interpreted is that Mercury in the third house indicates a middleness in the gender spectrum. And the way that that will exactly manifest for an individual will depend upon the rest of the conditions that Mercury in the chart has. But it basically and essentially means that the masculinity is toned down or dampened because the planet is not interested in utilizing the resources of this house. The resources of the house are masculine. The planet is interested in being neutered. So it's not interested in utilizing the masculinity of this house. So the result is that the masculine assets are underutilized. And some of the ramifications of that is that this person tends to be moderate. They tend not to be overly passionate or overly driven. And also, they tend to be non-initiating in how they pursue their objectives. Masculine nature is to immediately initiate the quest and the hunt and the search for what it wants. But if the maleness is dampened, then the initiative towards fulfilling one's desires is dampened, and instead one acts in a way to try to bring the desired objectives closer to us of their own accord, rather than us going to them. To bring up a very clear example of this dynamic, Boy George has Mercury in the third house. Not everybody with Mercury in the third house is Boy George. Why is Boy George Boy George? Why is he so male-dampened in such a literal way? Well, first of all, his third house is Cancer, which is a very feminine sign. So that's another domino falling against the masculinity, underutilizing the masculinity, dampening the masculinity. Another thing is that his Mercury in the third house, Cancer, is conjoined a feminine planet, the moon. Another thing is that he has a feminine planet rising in a feminine rising sign. He has Venus rising in Taurus. And the fourth thing and the final thing that I'll mention here is his Mercury in the third house is aspected strongly by Saturn, which is on the other gender-neutral planet. Now let's explore the second seed for Mercury in the third house. The fact that Mercury is dexterous and expert, and so is the third house. His third house is skillful, talented, and expert. So people with Mercury in the third house, this is a simple interpretation. These are talented people. What kind of talent? It's a certain kind of intellect. They're good at learning skills, and they're good at using skills, and they're good at expressing what they're thinking or what they're feeling or what they're imagining. So a very good example of this is Michelangelo. Michelangelo has Mercury in the third house. Why is Michelangelo? Not everybody is as intelligent and creative and expressive as Michelangelo, are they? Not everybody with Mercury in the third house is Michelangelo. Why is he so special? Well, first of all, his Mercury in the third house is conjoined Jupiter, the planet of philosophy and wisdom and learning. And it's in an air sign, Aquarius. Air signs are intellectual. And it's in its own Amsha, which is quite important. It's in the Gemini Amsha. It's in an airy Amsha as well. And Navamsha is Gemini. In addition to this, of one very important thing that makes Michelangelo so artistic is that his 11th lord is in the 5th house. If you've watched all of any of my videos, really, or some of my videos, you notice every time there's an artist, I always find this combination of 5, 11, and 3. Houses 5, 11, and 3. That's the signature for an extremely outstanding artist. So Michelangelo's case, the 11th lord is in the 5th house, while the 5th and the 3rd lords are exactly trine to each other. Now, the third and final seed for interpreting Mercury in the third house is that Mercury has to do with friendship and the third house has to do with peers. So there's two things that are classically said about Mercury in the third house which make sense in this regard. One thing is that they are a good sibling. In other words, they're not a selfish sibling or a competitive sibling, because that's been toned down by putting Mercury in this house. So they tend to be a cooperative or friendly, agreeable sibling. And in general, they're not selfish in their friendships. Another classic thing that's said about Mercury in the third house is that they like to work for the benefit of the needy. So they're charitable. So this is because their selfishness is toned down. And I think a good person to illustrate this is Oprah Winfrey. She has Mercury in the third house. And she's very generous. She's showing other people. She's not trying to show herself. She's a talk show host, so she's spotlighting other people, and she's very charitable, and she likes to give things away, and she forms charitable trusts and gives tons of money away. So why is this so true in her case? In her case, it's not just Mercury in the third house, but it's Mercury in the third house conjoined to the ninth lord, the sun. So the ninth house signifies all of those charitable and morality, etc. The ninth lord is conjoined. Mercury in the third house is going to bring out the charitable potential of Mercury in the third house. Also, her Mercury in the third house is completely, almost 100% aspected by Jupiter. Jupiter is a planet for morality, and morality has to do with charity. And finally, it's in Aquarius. And Aquarius has to do with reduction of selfishness and more focus on group identity. So these are the seeds and the basic interpretation of those seeds for Mercury in the third house. The exact way that each seed grows, as you can see from the three different examples, is slightly modified depending upon the soil of the rest of the chart and the conditions of Mercury in the third house. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have two groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. Before we discuss Mercury in the fourth house, I just want to mention that Mercury in the fourth house may have overtones of Mercury in the 10th and vice versa. And the way to ascertain whether that's the case is to see how close Mercury is to the same degree as the ascendant. The closer Mercury is to the ascendant's degree within its own sign, the more it will affect the opposite house and get the overtones of the opposite house. To understand the implication of Mercury in the fourth, let's start off by reviewing what the fourth house symbolizes. As you can see, it's the area of the sky that's directly below the ground. That's why it represents whatever and everything that it represents. It represents everything that pertains to the inner self, the stuff that's below the surface. And so that's why it's the house of the mind. And since it's the house of the mind, it has to do with emotions and contemplations. Now, because the mind has to do with emotion, it has to do with motions, like the things which set us in motion, our motivations, which also means that it shows what we are dedicated to and what we are devoted to. And that also implies that it shows our opinions about what's worthy and what's unworthy and what's good and what's bad. And on the other hand, because the mind involves contemplation, it also means how we feel, how we experience our own emotions. So the fourth house is the house for happiness, or a sense of peace, peace of mind, mental health, repose, a sense of rest, a sense of solidity and okayness. And hence the fourth house also represents stability. It is the ground beneath your feet. So it represents your reliability, your constancy, your dependability, the firmness of your foundation. Besides the inner self, innerness in general is also the theme of the fourth house. And so it has to do with femininity. It's also the house of privacy, internal affairs, internal things. And so it's a place of shyness and modesty and non-disclosure. Where can you be private? Inside your private space, right? So the fourth house represents your home and your private stuff, your private property, the things that belong to you. And finally, the fourth house represents your ancestry, what you've grown out of, the soil that you've grown out of, where your roots go. And so it particularly has to do with maternal ancestry and the mother, because it's also a feminine house. Now that we're clear about what the fourth house represents, we can interpret Mercury in it after we very quickly make sure we're clear about what Mercury represents. Mercury represents intellect, and intellect deals with decoding and putting into code, so codes and patterns. It is the planet that symbolizes communication, which is the ability to encode information and send it to someplace else. So it has to do with all of the communication encoding systems, languages, in other words. And language is not just verbal, but it's also numeric and it's also gestural and so forth. That's all symbolized by Mercury. Language enables interaction. So Mercury signifies interaction. Not just verbal or intellectual interaction, but all sorts of interaction, including and especially financial trade, exchanging things. When you interact with others, you establish relationships with them, and so Mercury has to do with relationships, especially friendships, or in other words, the relationship between equals. And because it's about friendship, Mercury is also about enjoying, just relaxing. So it's the planet of recreation. It's a witty planet. It tells good jokes. It's a fun planet. It's a youthful planet. And Mercury is also the planet that symbolizes learning. In other words, the ability to learn. Because it's about decoding the patterns that you receive. It's also about putting things into good patterns. The ability to put things into proper patterns, and hence it's about organization. And being efficient and being neat, crisp, clear. Hence, it's about symmetry. Symmetry is a good pattern. And because it's the planet of symmetry, it has to do with beauty and it has to do with balance. Balance both in an emotional or intellectual sense, as well as in a physical sense. So Mercury also represents dexterity, agility, and your expertise in doing things. So now that we're back up to speed or refreshed about what Mercury represents and what the fourth house represents, we can pretty easily describe what Mercury symbolizes when it's in the fourth house. All that we really need to do is take the symbolism of Mercury and put it next to the symbolism of the fourth house and look for things that stand out together, look for things that connect. For example, Mercury is the planet of intellect, and the fourth represents the mind. So here they connect, and this connection between intellect of Mercury and mind of the fourth house forms what I'll call the first seed of how you should interpret Mercury in the fourth house. It's very important to think of the astrological process as a seed growing into a plant which produces a fruit. The reason why that's a very important analogy is because the growth of the seed is affected by the conditions under which it grows. And it's really important not to interpret any planet without reference to the context of the chart in which it exists. The second seed of Mercury in the fourth house has to do with Mercury being about relationships, fourth house being about family. So this means we're going to interpret something that has to do with the way people relate to each other. The third seed has to do with Mercury being the planet of trade and the fourth house being about property and wealth. So this seed is going to turn into something that has to do with money. And the fourth seed for Mercury in the fourth house is that Mercury has to do with communication, but the fourth house has to do with introversion. So this is an example of where the planet and the house connect, but kind of an opposite fashion. So with this, we're going to have to discuss something about how the person with Mercury in the fourth house expresses themselves. So we have four basic seeds. One is about how they think. The second is about their relationships. The third is about their wealth. And the fourth is about how they express themselves. The first seed, that Mercury is the intellect and the fourth house is the mind. This means that these people have a feeling or sense or intuition for ideas. They feel for ideas. The thoughts are the things that motivate them. So people with Mercury in the fourth house are ideologically and intellectually motivated. Sure enough, if you look up people who have Mercury in the fourth house, by which I actually mean the fourth sign from the ascendant, then you'll find an unusual density of scientists. One person with Mercury in the fourth house is Paramahamsa Yogananda. He's very motivated by ideology. So let's take a look at his chart for a second to understand the growth of the seed within the context of the soil. Why is it that Paramahamsa Yogananda has Mercury in the fourth house and is extremely ideological, but other people with Mercury in the fourth house might not be nearly as ideological as him? The first condition is look at the sign of the fourth house. His fourth house is Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the fourth sign from his ascendant. Sagittarius itself is very idealistic and ideological. The second thing is to look at the conditions which are affecting Mercury in the fourth house. His Mercury is affected by Venus. Not only is Venus naturally or intrinsically Brahmanical or intellectual, also it's, in his case, the lord of his second house, which is the house of knowledge, and the lord of his ninth house as well, which is the house of philosophy. So his Mercury in the fourth house isn't just Mercury in the fourth house. It's Mercury in the fourth house in Sagittarius with the lord of the ninth and the lord of the second, who is a Brahmin or an intellectual. Finally, his Mercury also has significant aspect from both of the very heavy ideological planets, Jupiter and Saturn. Now let's take a look at the second seed, which is that Mercury has to do with relationships and the fourth house has to do with family. So we're going to say something about how the person relates. Basically, we would say that they're friendly, in that within themselves, within their fourth house, is the planet or the force which communicates with others. They like other people, they're relatable and they like to relate. Well, a good example of this is Jack Black, Mercury in the fourth house. But now I want to show you an example of someone with Mercury in the fourth house who is not very friendly at all, to show you how important the conditions of the soil can be towards a seed. This person is Richard Ramirez. So yes, he has Mercury in the fourth house, but first of all, that Mercury is debilitated because it's in Pisces. So he has a debilitated Mercury in the fourth house. So that's a hint that maybe the seeds are not going to grow straight. Maybe the seeds are going to grow crooked or down or weak or something. much more significantly than even his Mercury being debilitated is the fact that it is exactly conjoined Ketu. And Ketu symbolizes unusual behavior. And even on top of that, it is also conjoined to the moon. Putting the intellect in the fourth house gives it a sense of being intuitive, but also putting the moon there kind of pushes it over the edge into being irrational. So we certainly shouldn't jump to the conclusion that somebody with Mercury in the fourth house is going to be a serial killer like Richard Ramirez. But if that fourth house is Pisces, and if that Mercury is in the fourth house with the moon, who is the eighth lord, and who is pushing the emotional content of the fourth house, which is causing the intellectual function of Mercury to kind of drown. And furthermore, if that moon is waning or completely waned, as is the case for Richard Ramirez, it's a new moon. But most of all, if that Mercury is exactly conjoined Ketu, then you have a very suspicious, mentally disturbed chart. So now you can see how sometimes a seed may grow in the opposite direction than what it normally grows. So in Jack Black's case, Mercury in the fourth house grows to be a highly relatable person. But in Richard Ramirez's case, it grows the opposite direction. But it's still the same seed. It's still the same theme. The third seed of Mercury in the fourth house is that Mercury has to do with trade, and the fourth house has to do with property and wealth. So we must say something about how the person deals with money. We would say that a person with Mercury in the fourth house is probably wealthy. They deal well with money. They know how to exchange money. They understand business. And therefore they have good property and they enjoy fancy things. Good example of this is Bill Gates. Why is Bill Gates particularly wealthy? Well, it's because of the conditions under which his Mercury is in the fourth house. Again, the sign of the fourth house is really important. His fourth house is Libra. Libra is a trade positive sign. It's a mercantile sign. Furthermore, his Mercury is conjoined to Mars, which is the Yogacara, which means that it is the planet which simultaneously owns an angle and a trine. So it's extremely powerful for tangible success. Furthermore, that Yogacara, Mars, is actually making a Raj Yoga by Parivartana, the fact that it's the fifth lord in the fourth house while the fourth lord is in the fifth house. But to really find all of the wealth for Bill Gates, it may not necessarily be founded on the fact that his Mercury is in the fourth house, you see. His Mercury being in the fourth house may be an additional evidence of wealth. The real proof of the wealth may be elsewhere. So for example, in his case, he has an incredible combination of financial houses. He has the seventh lord for trade, conjoined the second lord for money, and the 11th lord for profit, all in the fifth house, the house of intellect. So the whole context of his chart is very intelligent for how to earn. And so in those conditions, Mercury in the fourth house really supports becoming wealthy. The final seed of Mercury in the fourth house was that Mercury has to do with communication and the fourth house has to do with introversion. We want to say something, therefore, about how the person communicates or expresses themselves. We don't exactly want to say that they communicate in a normal way effectively, because introspection is sort of the opposite of communication, or it's only one aspect of the communication. Yet, having the communicative planet inside of the depths of the being means that the person has an affinity to communicate. But what it's really saying is that they communicate on an intuitive level, and they communicate creatively, or they communicate artistically. They may not interact with us in conventional ways, but they do interact with us unconventionally or unusually. Many, many artists have Mercury in the fourth house. For example, Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso is so artistic, but it's not just because Mercury is in the 4th house. First of all, his Mercury in the 4th house is conjoining his first lord, so it's making it more important. But second of all, his Mercury is his 11th lord, which is the house for art, the key house for art. And Mercury is exactly aspected by his 5th lord, which is another artistic house. So whenever I talk about artists in any of my videos, you always hear me talk about the importance of the 3rd, 5th, and 11th, and somewhat the 4th. And my point is that when you combine the lords of the 3rd, 5th, and 11th, then you get an artist. So here with Pablo Picasso, look at what's going on. His 11th lord is Mercury in the 4th house. It's exactly aspected by his 5th lord, while his 3rd lord, Venus, is in his 3rd house. So now I think that you have a good understanding of what Mercury represents in the 4th house, and you've also seen a few examples of how to consider the chart in which Mercury is in the 4th house, so that you can understand what seeds will grow, how well, and in what direction. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tara Bala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. Let's discuss Mercury in the 5th house. If you have Mercury in the 5th house, you may also want to consider the implications of Mercury in the 11th house. Because when Mercury occupies the 5th sign from the ascendant, it's very likely that it has a significant aspect on the 11th sign from the ascendant. Vice versa, if you have Mercury in the 11th house, you might want to wind up here in this video. Now, let's begin our discussion of Mercury in the 5th, starting with a quick review of what the 5th house is. The 5th house is a part of the underground quadrant, so it has to do with the things that are internal to our being. But it's on the western side of that underground section. So everything about the 5th house has to do with the way our internal being moves towards other people. We can separate that into 2 symbolic columns. One is the way we express or share our ideas, and the other is the way we express or share our feelings. On these 2 columns, we can understand everything that the 5th house is known for. 5th is the house of intelligence, because intelligence is our capacity to share and exchange ideas. The 5th house is the house of communication, because how do you exchange ideas? By communication. The 5th is the house of expression, because how do you communicate? By expressing. And so since it's the house of expression, it also has to do with creativity and art. The 5th is the house of empathy or compassion or sympathy, because it's about how well we share feelings with other people. The 5th house is the house of love, because that's what empathy basically is. Finally, the 5th house is famous as the house of children. This is because literally the western section of the underground portion means how we produce another person from within ourselves. Also, children are related to the other 2 columns of meaning of the 5th house. Children are produced by love. Children are the easiest object for love. And children represents productivity. fertility, creativity. Now that we're up to speed on the 5th house, let's quickly get up to speed about Mercury, and then we can talk about Mercury in the 5th house. Fundamentally, Mercury represents intellect. Intellect has to do with the way we process codes and put things into codes or patterns. So Mercury is a planet of communication because that's how you understand codes and patterns in languages and sounds and words and numbers, etc. Mercury is the planet of interaction because what do you do when you communicate? You interact. Mercury is the planet of relationships because that's what interaction leads to. Mercury is the planet of recreation because having relationships with people means friendship. Friendships means play. So Mercury has to do with relaxation, recreation, having fun, being funny, being youthful and childlike. Mercury is the planet of learning because learning is the ability to recognize and comprehend patterns and codes. Mercury is the planet of organization because what is organization? It's the ability to keep things in good patterns. Mercury is the planet of symmetry because what is symmetry? It's organization of patterns. Mercury is the planet of dexterity because symmetry gives balance and balance gives dexterity, and dexterity implies expertise, talent, finesse. Now that we took a little time to refresh ourselves on the 5th house and Mercury, it's fairly easy to talk about what Mercury represents when it's in the 5th house. To have that discussion, all we need to do is put the symbolism of Mercury next to the symbolism of the 5th house and see where things link up. For example, Mercury represents intellect and the 5th house represents intelligence. So obviously the symbolism is linked up here. And intelligence is going to be something important about how you interpret Mercury in the 5th house. Mercury is a planet of friendship and relationships. The 5th house has to do with love and empathy. And friendship or love is going to be an important part of interpreting Mercury in the 5th house. Mercury represents communication, 5th house represents expression. And so communicative expression is a key aspect of Mercury in the 5th house. Finally, Mercury is youthful, childlike, and the 5th house has to do with children. So these are like 4 seeds of how you interpret Mercury in the 5th house. If we take each seed and put it in soil, in other words, if we put it into the context of a chart, it will grow into a tree that shows an exact form that represents a particular interpretation. Let me show you the way that the tree generally grows for each one of these seeds. For example, we said that Mercury represents intellect and the 5th house represents intelligence. So intellect should be an important part of how we interpret Mercury in the 5th house. So we should say this native with Mercury in the 5th house is intelligent. And what do we mean by intelligent? They are educated. They like education. They like to get information. They like to be educated. We can say that they're brilliant. They come up with new ideas. They're inventive. And we can say that they're fit to teach and fit to guide or advise people. So I'd like to mention 3 examples of people with Mercury in the 5th house right now. Karl Marx, Malcolm X, and Leonardo da Vinci. These are very intelligent, philosophical, idealistic people who are also big advisors or leaders or teachers, who are also very new in their thinking. They're brilliant. Leonardo da Vinci in particular really seems to exemplify the brilliance of Mercury in the 5th house. So let's take a second to look at the soil of his particular chart. So you can see in addition to him having Mercury in the 5th house, he also has a Sagittarius ascendant. He also has Jupiter and the moon tightly joined in Pisces. Finally, his Mercury in the 5th house has the aspect of an exalted planet from the 11th. And also his 5th lord has the same aspect. Now let's look at the second seed of Mercury's interpretation when it's in the fifth house. The thing about Mercury representing friendship and the fifth house having to do with love. What do we expect from this? We expect this person to be friendly. In other words, they're sort of warm. They're not cold. In other words, they're empathetic. They feel for you. They're not callous. The third seat of Mercury in the fifth house, Mercury is communication, and the fifth house is expression. So what do we say about people with Mercury in the fifth house? They're persuasive. In other words, not only are they empathetic to others, but they can make other people empathetic towards them. They know what to say. They know how to express themselves in such a way that other people will listen and pay attention and understand what they're saying. In this regard, I'd like to mention Aretha Franklin, Anais Nin, and the Malcolm X and the other people that we already mentioned. The people previously mentioned, like Karl Marx and Malcolm X, they had a huge audience, many people listening to them. But think about Aretha Franklin and Anais Nin. Anais Nin, everybody wants to read her diaries because she's able to create empathy. Aretha Franklin, everybody wants to listen to her because they identify with her. Her voice and her words and her way of expressing herself creates an empathy in the listener. Finally, Mercury represents youth and the fifth house represents children. So what do you expect from people with Mercury in the fifth house? They're youthful. They get along well with children, and you probably find them surrounded with children a lot, which also means surrounded by people that they're raising. So it also means surrounded by students, surrounded by followers, like in the case of Malcolm X, like in the case of Karl Marx. But it can also mean school teachers. It can also mean parents that are very good at raising lots of kids. One more chart I want to mention with Mercury in the fifth house is Krishna's chart according to Surdas. So he's a great example of all of these aspects of Mercury in the fifth, because he's extremely intelligent and the guider of everybody. And at the same time, extremely youthful and friendly and relatable. So he's a very good example of Mercury in the fifth house. And see, his Mercury in the fifth house is in Virgo. So it's exalted, and it's in mutual aspect with Jupiter, who is also domicile. So hopefully this shows you the basis of what Mercury in the fifth house is all about, the four seeds of how you can understand it, and then how those seeds tend to grow into interpretations. But you should always realize that depending upon the soil of the chart, it will change or alter the way that the seed grows. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have two groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. The newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. Understanding Mercury in the sixth house begins by understanding the sixth house and Mercury. So let's begin by reviewing what these two symbolize. The sixth house is the area of the sky that's directly below the western horizon. So it symbolizes things that support or uphold the sunset. Sunset has two connotations: disappearance and other people. So for example, the sixth is the house of illness, because disease leads to death and death is disappearance. The sixth is the house of dreads, things that you do not want to see, things that you're worried about, things that you're fearful of. The sixth is the house of minorities, the people who are overlooked, the subordinates. And the sixth is the house of enemies, so it's about people who take from you. So enemies, thieves, rivals, competitors. The sixth is the house of conflict, how we get into conflict with the people that are trying to take from us. So it's all about struggles, weapons, efforts to defend. And finally, the sixth is the house of debts, and having our resources benefit other people instead of us. So that's what the sixth house basically represents. Now we just need to do a quick review of what Mercury represents. Mercury is the planet of intellect. And intellect has to do with putting things into codes and patterns. So it's a planet that symbolizes communication, because communication is what happens when you encode something in a format like a number, a word, a language, and then you can transmit it to somebody else. So Mercury has to do with communication. Mercury has to do with interaction, because that's what communication is. So it has to do with exchanging things, exchanging information, exchanging goods, trade. Mercury has to do with relationship, because that's what happens when you interact and exchange with people, you develop relationship. So Mercury is friendly, likes to form relationships. And finally, Mercury has to do with recreation or relaxation, because that's what happens when you have friendly relationships. Now, about patterns, Mercury is all about learning. Learning is the ability to recognize patterns and make sense of them. Mercury is the planet of organization, because organization means knowing your patterns and keeping things in the right patterns. Mercury is the planet of symmetry, because symmetry means having balanced patterns. Mercury is the planet of dexterity, because if you're balanced, then you have a lot of dexterity. So now that we're refreshed about what Mercury symbolizes and what the sixth house symbolizes, all that we really need to do is put them side by side and see where they connect. For example, Mercury represents friendship, but the sixth house is about enemies. So they're connecting here in a conflicting way. And so this is something very important about Mercury in the sixth house, which we have to devote some attention to try to unpack into an interpretation that we could put into words. Another thing is that Mercury represents exchange, but the sixth house represents conflict. And that's again a connection between Mercury and the sixth house, which is not really affable. Mercury wants to exchange and cooperate with others, but the sixth house wants to exchange with conflict. So that's another thing about Mercury in the sixth house that we can call a seed. You start to get a clear intuition already about what's going on with this planet in this house. A third and final thing that's important with Mercury in the sixth house is that Mercury has to do with relaxation, but the sixth house has to do with anxiety. So Mercury is not really connecting with the sixth house in very favorable or easy ways. So a lot of people who are watching this video who want to just hear a good thing will suddenly get upset with me for only presenting negative things about Mercury in the sixth house. But hold on to your hats, because this is way too early in the astrological game to determine whether something comes out positively or negatively for you, as I'll show in a bit. So put aside your distaste for hearing negative things and just hear about Mercury in the sixth house, and then think about how that would actually work in some conditions. It could produce really bad interpretations, yes, and it also could produce really good interpretations. So let's take a look at these three seeds and see how they might grow into more verbalizable interpretations. For example, Mercury represents friendship and the sixth house represents enemies. So people with the Mercury in the sixth house, they could be described by the word separative, in the sense that they're not really eager to accept new friends, and they tend to assume enmity or dangerousness in others. So one saying for them is, you are my enemy until proven my friend. If you prove yourself my friend, then you're my friend. But otherwise, I have to assume that you're my enemy. Now, you might not like the way that sounds. That might sound like a negative thing. And it can be a very negative thing, but it can also be a very positive trait. Because, folks, that is the world. It can be a very healthy thing to have this attitude. It can be very helpful when dealing with the actual world, which is full of enemies. Let's look at the second seed now of Mercury in the sixth house, which was that Mercury has to do with exchange, cooperative exchange, but the sixth house has to do with conflicting exchange. So we expect people with Mercury in the sixth house are argumentative, assuming that the way they need to react is defensive. Again, you might think, this is very depressing. I don't want to have Mercury in the sixth house. I don't want to be defensive. And yes, maybe you are being overly defensive and you're ruining your relationships. But being defensive can be a really good thing if it's in the right measure and applied in the right ways, because most people are really out to get us. So bear that in mind, that it's not really negativity or positivity in the planet and the house, but in how it sits with everything else in the chart to show how you would use this trait. These so-called negative traits of certain planets and certain houses can be used in positive or negative ways, depending on how well you, as the native, understand yourself and understand these dynamics within you. The final seed of Mercury in the sixth house is that Mercury has to do with relaxation, but the sixth house has to do with anxiety. And so people with Mercury in the sixth house, they tend to be anxious. And what do we mean about anxious? They don't stop thinking about the problem. They don't stop thinking about the enemy, the danger, the rival, the competitor. They don't relax and let that go. Is that a negative trait? Yeah, it can be really negative and stressful to be like that. But that can also be a positive trait because it can make you very successful, because you will spend the time and energy to figure out how to defeat your opponent and overcome your problems. Sure enough, very important, successful, positive contributors to society have had Mercury in the sixth house. Take a look at some of them. Good examples of Mercury in the sixth house. They all kind of have that tough edge to them, but they all use that to their advantage. Let's take a look at some of their charts and details and see why. Now, of course, it has to do with how they've learned about themselves during their lifetime, but also you can see from the chart how easy or difficult it will be for a native to learn how to use this thing positively or negatively. So in the case of Kamala Harris, sure, she has Mercury in the sixth house, but Mercury is her first lord. She has a Gemini ascendant. The first lord tends to be given positive interpretations wherever it goes. So that's one thing. Also, her sixth house from the ascendant is also the sixth house from the moon. So having Mercury in the sixth house, it's getting the synergy of being in the sixth house twice. It's like a bhavottama situation. And so it's developing a synergy where it becomes like swakshetra or domicile in how it operates. It's used to being in this place. It's deeply in this place, and so it starts to work better in this place. Also, her Jupiter and her ninth lord, Saturn, both strongly aspect this sixth house. And we know that when benefic planets and benefic lords affect a house, the interpretation of that house has to be put in a more positive light. So you would interpret Kamala Harris as a person who doesn't trust people, who assumes that they're out to get her, whom you have to prove yourself to her before she accepts you as a friend, and who always thinks about how to defeat problems and overcomes enemies. And that is not her weakness, but her strength. Let's take a look at Russell Brand. Russell Brand has Mercury in the sixth house, but his sixth house is Gemini. here you have a planet in its own sign. And that makes the interpretations much more positive, or much more easier to go towards their positive permutation or possibility. He also has Capricorn ascending. And so everything about Mercury, which is oriented towards being critical of others, has some synergy now. Because Capricorn is also really good at being cynical and being critical and being suspicious of others. So just as Kamala Harrison had this synergy in her chart, causing her Mercury to be better, Russell Brand has the same thing, same synergy, a synergy between Mercury in the 6th house and Capricorn ascending. Furthermore, his 8th lord and his 6th lord have joined in the 6th house. So his 8th lord Sun has joined his 6th lord Mercury, and this is a positive, powerful yoga. To put two Dustan lords in the same place in a Dustan. I think we should also take a look at Lionel Messi's chart, because he's a good example of knowing how to defeat the enemies and not assuming that anybody is going to make a mistake or give him anything. And also, he's interesting because he has an athletic application. So sure enough, his Mercury in the 6th house is with Mars. That explains or points us in the right direction of assuming that the traits of his Mercury in the 6th house would apply themselves to athletics or competition. In addition, it's not just Mars, but Mars is his 3rd lord, so it really makes it clear to us. He again has the 8th lord in the 6th house. His Mercury is the 8th lord. So just like with Russell Brand, he's got this synergy of a Dustan lord going into another Dustan house, which gives things a positive slant. Furthermore, he has the 3rd lord joining the 8th lord in the 6th house, so it's very powerful in defeating opponents. So that aspect of being anxious, which is the potential of Mercury in the 6th house, for him it turns out to be, he's really got his enemies on his mind. He figures them out before they defeat him. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil on which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. The newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. To understand Mercury in the 7th house, first we should understand Mercury and the 7th house. So here's the 7th house. It's literally the part of the sky that surrounds the western horizon. The west is where the sun sets, and that is the basis of everything that the 7th house represents. So sunset represents 2 things: disappearance and non-self, because the sun represents self. When it goes away, then that means non-self, other people. On the theme of disappearance, the 7th house therefore represents endings, like death. And it also just represents things going away or travel, moving to a destination. Now, the 7th house is not particularly famous as a death house, and that's probably mostly because the 6th and the 8th house have more to do with the conditions that actually lead to death. But even more so than that, if we talk about a planet in the 7th house, we get a slightly different dynamic. because the planet that's in the seventh house will probably or will often be very strongly aspecting the ascendant, and therefore you won't get the effect of it disappearing. You'll get the effect of it becoming prominent. The things that the seventh house is famous for, of course, is partnership and marriage. So since it's about partners, it's also about how we intercourse or cooperate with other people. Intercourse also means sex. And the seventh house is also about that. But not just sex, any kind of interaction with other people, including any sorts of way of trading and exchanging and doing commerce. Now, what we're going to want to do to understand Mercury in this house is take these symbolisms and compare them with Mercury symbolisms. So for half a minute, let's still just kind of relax and pause and make sure that we understand Mercury's symbolisms. The basis of everything that Mercury symbolizes is intellect. Intellect has to do with codes and patterns. This is why Mercury represents communication, because communication is encoded consciousness, encoded ideas. So it has to do with all the systems of encoding, like languages, maths, numbers, gestures, everything. That's all Mercury. Now, because Mercury has to do with communication, it has to do with interaction. And because it has to do with interaction, it has to do with relationships and friendships, just like the seventh house. And because it has to do with friendships, it has to do with recreation and having fun. Mercury is also the planet of learning. It makes sense if it's the planet of intellect, right? Mercury is a planet of organization. It's a very neat, efficient, organized planet because organization means your patterns are in proper order. Symmetry. Mercury represents symmetry because that means your patterns are all balanced. And because Mercury represents symmetry, it's very, very important for beauty and balance or neutrality between things. On the topic of balance, Mercury actually has a lot to do with our dexterity, our physical balance, our physical refinement, our ability to do detailed things. Now that we're refreshed on what Mercury and the seventh house represent, we're ready to put them together and see what Mercury would do and represent in the seventh house. You just have to look for how the symbolism of Mercury gets along with the symbolism of the seventh house. For example, Mercury is the planet of interaction, and the seventh house symbolizes interaction, intercourse, exchange. So we're going to want to interpret that. Another thing we're going to want to interpret is that Mercury has to do with friendship, and the seventh house has to do with partnership. And the third thing that we're going to want to interpret to understand Mercury in the seventh house is that Mercury has to do with exchange, and the seventh house is about exchange too. We'll start with this energy of Mercury being the planet of interaction in the house of interaction or intercourse. So it's because of this that people with Mercury in the seventh house tend to be very intelligent. This is one of the things. They know how to interact. They know how to interact with people. They also know how to interact with things. They know how to use things. And they know how to talk to people. They know how to communicate with people. They know how to learn, pick up cues. Some of the famous people who have Mercury in the seventh house, just in my small database, include Nicholas Copernicus, Carl Sagan, Hermann Hesse, and René Guénon. So these are super geniuses, right? And they're also a certain type of genius that was very efficient in their communication as well. The other thing we said about Mercury in the seventh house is it's the planet of friendship in the house of partnership. So that must mean something important. What does it mean? It means that these people are appealing. You kind of want to be their friend. You feel drawn towards friendship with them. You want to be on their side. You want to see things from their point of view because it's easy to see things from their point of view because they share their point of view effectively because they're intelligent. So these people are relatable and they're understandable, and they tend to be able to transmit their worldview into other people's points of view. Bob Dylan, Barack Obama, And then two really interesting types, Adolf Hitler and Charles Manson. I particularly would want to compare three of these people, Charles Manson, Adolf Hitler, and Bob Dylan, to see what's actually going on in these charts. And we'll do that in a second. Let's just finish up this part of the discussion and look at the third thing about Mercury in the 7th house, which was it's the planet of exchange in the house of exchange. So what does that really mean for our interpretation? It means, again, that they're intelligent. This is the second thing contributing to these natives being very intelligent. Because, again, it means the same thing. They know how to exchange with things. And it also is indicating that they have a flair or a knack for exchange. So they know how to communicate their ideas, their ideals, their points of view in such a way that you feel like they're your points of view. And so they communicate in an appealing way. And so they have also like a flair in the sense of having an art. They have a sort of an art to how they communicate. And another implication of this is that they're quite good with business. They're quite good with money. They're wealthy. It's not really a luxurious type of person. It's kind of like an economical type of person who understands money and therefore gets a lot of it. Now, I said I wanted to look more closely at Charles Manson, Adolf Hitler, and Bob Dylan, and it's always actually quite a good idea to do so that you can actually see how something like Mercury in the 7th actually works in a bigger context of somebody's entire chart, or even just bigger context like what sign is it in. Now, why do I want to talk about these three people? Because it's so interesting that they're in a category together. If it weren't for astrology, we might not really think of putting these three people in the same category. But because of astrology and the fact that they all have Mercury in the 7th, they all wind up in this one category together. And if you think about it, they do belong in a category together, don't they? They're all sort of envelope pushers, but especially they're all really good at knowing how to utilize other people, attracting other people to their cause, at knowing how to take their points of view and make them your point of view. But of course, there's quite a difference in a sense between the three, even though Hitler and Manson, we might say, are kind of more similar to each other than they are to Bob Dylan, because they're sort of like on the bad guy side. And so that would be really interesting to see how is that expressed in these charts. So if we start off, right away we notice, well, Dylan's Mercury in the 7th house is in Gemini. That's pretty nice. That really, because Gemini belongs to Mercury. So that makes his Mercury in the 7th house more mercurial, more textbook, more like you actually would expect Mercury in the 7th house to be. And more poetic and more communicative than even the baseline of what you would expect. Whereas Hitler's Mercury is in Aries and Manson's Mercury is in Scorpio, both of which are signs that belong to Mars, the planet of anger, violence, war, etc., aggression. So right away, just by looking at what sign Mercury in the 7th is in, you can already get a feeling that Hitler would be more like Manson, and Manson and Hitler would be less like Dylan, even though you could put them all in the same category. Additionally, you see Dylan's Mercury is with very close to Venus, and that Venus is the 11th lord. So Venus by its nature already is artistic, and then as the 11th lord, it's hyper-artistic. So that's what's influencing Dylan's Mercury in the 7th house. Whereas for Hitler, his Mercury is all by itself in Aries. It's just getting influenced by Aries. And for Manson, his Mercury is with Jupiter. Jupiter should be philosophical and everything. But Jupiter is the 8th lord. And it's also with Venus, who is the 6th lord. And you could say Jupiter is also his 11th lord, but primarily by its multricone, by its male domicile, it's the 8th lord. Secondarily, it's the 11th lord, and he's into making music and all that stuff too. And same thing with Venus, but his Venus is his 6th lord. So you really have the 6th and the 8th lord with his Mercury. These two Dustan houses, these two difficult houses. No matter what planet you're analyzing, you also want to look at certain other things like the rising sign of the moon. Let's take a look at the moon because it's very obvious with these 3 charts. Dylan's moon is in Taurus. Well, that does a lot of things for the moon. It makes it exalted and it puts it in touch with Venus, the owner of Taurus. Hitler's moon, on the other hand, it's in Capricorn, Saturn sign. And guess where Manson's moon is? It's in Aquarius, another sign that belongs to Saturn. So again, it's like Hitler and Manson are kind of similar to each other in the way that they're not similar with Dylan. Even though all 3 of these people are like artists. These 2 guys on the bottom, they veered away from being artists and they became violent. Whereas the guy on top stayed an artist through and through. If you think about what's going on with the moons, it's also quite interesting. Dylan's moon is with Jupiter, who's the 1st lord. So his 1st lord is also in his Venus sign. Whereas in Hitler's case, look at his moon. It's close to Ketu, and it's super close to Jupiter, which is supposed to be good, but this is in Capricorn, where Jupiter is debilitated. Look at Manson, and he has almost the exact same signature. His moon is super close to Rahu. So this look into these 3 specific charts shows you how Mercury in the 7th house has this basic background template of giving a person who's very intelligent and knows how to deal with situations and people so that their points of view are understood and even adopted by others. And these people are relatable and likable and attract people and tend to become wealthy even though they're not luxurious. That's the basic template for Mercury in the 7th house. But you can see that depending upon the other conditions that Mercury is in and the other conditions of the moon and the ascendant, etc., the basic potentials of Mercury in the 7th house either veer in one direction or the other. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. Mercury in the 8th house is quite interesting because it's one of the few or only planets that really thrives here inherently. To understand the specifics of Mercury in the 8th house, let's start by reviewing what the 2 parts of this recipe signify independently of each other. In other words, what does the 8th house symbolize and what does Mercury symbolize? Then let's put them together. So as you can see here, the 8th house is the area of the sky that is right above the western horizon. So basically, when you are noticing a sunset, then the sun is in the 8th house. This physical reality of the 8th house is the basis for everything that the 8th house signifies. It signifies the erosion of the western horizon. And since the western horizon represents disappearance, the 8th house represents disappearance in the sense of how can we prevent disappearance? Also, since the Western horizon represents other people, the 8th house represents other people, but specifically in the sense of how do we prosper from other people? What do they give to us? So because it's a house that has to do with detangling disappearances, it has to do with mysticism. Mysticism means secrets, things that people don't see, things that are disappeared. Occult, psychic things, psychological things, intuitive things, spiritual things, anything that falls into the category of something which is real but not tangible. Because the 8th house can see these things, it is an important place for intelligence and insight, the insight part of intelligence. So the 8th house will give us our ability to scrutinize something, discover something, research and find something, analyze something to find the parts of it that nobody else saw, like to find where the mistakes are especially. So to critique things is a very 8th house talent. And then also the 8th house has to do with death, but it's particularly about how can we prolong it or put it off? What prolongs it? What puts it off? So it has to do with vitality and the ability to create life. So reproduction and sexuality and libido. Now the area of sky that's above the western horizon also has to do with what we can get from other people. So it has to do with personal gains from relationships. So it will have to do with inheritances, for example, what other people give you, gifts, donations. And it also has to do with individuality or keeping distance from a group. So it's kind of remaining separate from a group or being defined of a group, nonconformity. That's the 8th house. Now, if we take a look at Mercury, we'll know all the things that we need in the recipe of Mercury in the 8th house. Mercury basically is the planet that symbolizes intellect. And intellect has to do with codes and patterns. So if we look at the codes part first, Mercury is the planet of communication because communications are encoded forms of information. And how do we encode them? We use words, languages, we use numbers, math. So Mercury represents all those different vehicles for communication and the communication skills themselves. And so therefore it's also the symbol of interaction, our ability to interact with things and people. And therefore it also has to do with how well we trade things with people in exchange, and that's why it has a financial component to it. Mercury is the planet for relationships because it's all about how we interact by communicating or communing with people. So Mercury is a very friendly planet. It likes to form relationships and partnerships. And it's recreational, which means what do you do in a relationship? Especially a friendly relationship. You have fun. You be youthful. You tell jokes and things like that. So Mercury is very good at doing the type of things that are to be done in friendly relationships. Now about the patterns of the intellect, Mercury is very good at learning new patterns. So it has a strong ability to recognize a pattern, find a pattern, and a strong ability to understand what things mean and to predict what's going to happen next based on the pattern of what happened before. Mercury has to do with organization because organization is how you put your patterns together and how you fit your patterns and how you store your patterns. So Mercury is very efficient, organized, and neat. Mercury is great with symmetry because symmetry means the patterns are balanced. So Mercury is all about balance, symmetry, and therefore beauty as well. Finally, it's the planet that represents our dexterity because dexterity is reliant upon balance. So now that we've understood Mercury and the 8th house, it's not going to be too hard for us to put the two together and see what kind of a cookie this recipe makes. All that you have to do is take what Mercury symbolizes and put it side by side with what the 8th house symbolizes and see where they link up. For example, Mercury is the planet of intellect, and the 8th house represents the intellect in terms of insight. So that's a very important thing, that the planet really links with the house, because the planet has to do with intellect and the house has to do with insight. So when Mercury is in the 8th house, that's a main descriptor of what it represents. Now, in a second, I'll flesh that out a bit more for you. But for now, just keep it like that. In your mind, keep that as like a seed of what Mercury in the 8th house means. This is the most important thing. Why is it so important? Because it's coming from a symbolism of Mercury that's extremely deep in its symbolic tree. It's not a derivative. It's a root symbolism for Mercury. It's the root symbolism, intellect. So this will be the overriding characteristic of Mercury in the 8th house, the intellect joining the insight. But another thing which is not unimportant is that Mercury has to do with relationships, yet the 8th house has to do with individuality, which can be counter to relationships, but it also has to do with gaining from relationships. So there's a complicated thing. So I'll flesh this one out for you too in a second. But for now, just let that percolate or ferment in your head. When Mercury is in the 8th house, something is special about the way the person goes about relationship and individuality. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the fact that Mercury has to do with trade, and the 8th house has to do with gains. So let's flesh these three out and see a more verbose version of what Mercury in the 8th house represents. It's not really always the case that the more verbose is the better description, because the more you add verbosity, the more you take away subtlety and intuition. But if you're not sure what these three things mean yet, it's really important to get a verbose explanation of it. So let's do that now. So what does it mean that the intellect is joining the insight when Mercury is in the 8th house? It means this person has a good intellect. What kind of intellect specifically? Specifically, they have an ability to comprehend mysticism, which we can describe as they can see the unseen or know the unknown. And as a result, this person will be very comfortable in areas where people are usually uncomfortable. They'll be knowledgeable in areas where people usually aren't knowledgeable. And they'll feel at home in areas where people usually don't. So you can find them involved in taboo things or forbidden things, occult things, blasphemous things, mystical things, spiritual things, etc. This intellect would be great for doing psychology, would be great for doing astrology, would be great for doing anything where you have to, any kind of science where you're discovering things from the unknown or figuring things out that are very difficult to directly perceive. We have several people here who really exemplify this with Mercury in the 8th house. Edgar Cayce, Osho or Rajneesh, Hugh Hefner, very taboo-oriented and also quite intelligent. And David Berkowitz, a serial killer. Well, this is also a possibility of being very comfortable with things that are forbidden or being very into the unknown. So we will look at three of these charts in more detail in a bit. But for now, let's move on and look at the second principle of Mercury in the 8th house, which is that it's the planet of relationships in the house of individuality. What does it basically mean? It means they are punishing of others. They relate with others quite well, but they tend to be the one who gains from the relationship, or they tend to be the one who dominates in the relationship. So a punisher can mean a few things depending on how dignified Mercury is mostly. Mercury in the 8th house, for example, is an excellent judge or lawyer, especially a judge. One of the reasons for this is that they see the unseen. So you're trying to lie to a person with Mercury in the 8th house, but it's not working because they see the unseen. They see what you're trying to hide. And also because they're good in research. So they'll be good in detective work to figure out who really did what. Mercury in the 8th house can also be described as critical, because the friendliness of Mercury doesn't really quite sit so well with the criticalness of the 8th house. So this will always be there with Mercury in the 8th house, but it will be more unpalatable the more undignified Mercury is. The thing about Mercury is that it's very balanced, so it's impartial. This is another reason why it's a very good judge, because it's impartial and objective. But it's also why it becomes critical. It would be critical even to its friends, in other words. It wouldn't say, well, you're my friend, so I'll overlook this, or you're my countrymate, so I don't care that you did this wrong, or you're my president, so I don't care that you did this wrong, or you're my same religion as me, so I'll overlook your problems. It's very impartial, and so therefore it's going to strike a friend or a housemate or a countrymate or whatever as being critical. In the lowest dignity, we could explain that they're very harsh. The people who would feel the harshness from Mercury in the 8th house the most would be the people who consider themselves the friend of that person. I'm in the same group as you, but yet you turned on me. That's how they are going to feel. So that's very harsh. They're going to feel like you're very harsh. But the person with Mercury in the 8th house is thinking, what do you mean? You just did something wrong. And I'm just pointing it out like I would for anybody else. But there's another undercurrent going on with Mercury in the 8th house, which has to also be kept in mind at the same time that you're thinking about these things. It's the fact that Mercury is likable. And this 8th house has like a sexual charisma to it. So Mercury in the 8th house, those people tend to be attractive or likable. So it doesn't come across usually as an overwhelming feeling of, ew, this person is so critical. Another third thing about Mercury in the 8th house is that Mercury has to do with trade, and the 8th house has to do with gains. So in a sense, this means the person is probably wealthy. Yet because it's the 8th house, they're gaining a lot of wealth directly in connection with their relationships. So they probably gain a lot of wealth, but also use a lot of wealth within the context of their relationships. Now, as I promised, we should look more carefully at 3 of these charts of these people with Mercury in the 8th house. I wanted to look at Edgar Cayce and compare with Osho and compare with Berkowitz. So here are the 3 charts. You can see that these people are really obvious poster children or archetypes for Mercury in the 8th house, or just the 8th house in general, because their 8th house is packed. They have about, like a half a dozen connections to their 8th house, not just from the fact that they have 4 or 5 planets there, but also by virtue of the first lord being there and the 8th lord also being there and things like that. Parivartana is being formed from the 8th house, etc. Edgar Cayce, one of the most famous psychics in history. So that makes a lot of sense, because the 8th house is intelligent for the unknown, right? His 8th house happens to be Pisces, and that's always the first thing you should look at. After you just consider the house, you should say, what sign is this house? And everybody knows Pisces is also very abstract and psychological and spiritual. However, you might think, oh, it's Pisces, Mercury would be debilitated here. But Mercury is not alone here, is with Venus, who's exalted. And so that exaltation causes a special condition on Mercury's debilitation called Nichbhanga. Now, the strongest conjunction to his Mercury is between Rahu and Saturn, who happens to be the 6th lord. Well, the conjunction with Rahu is very telling. Mercury's conjunction with Rahu makes a mind an intellect that does not operate normally and doesn't even really comprehend how it operates, because it's making leaps and skipping the logical steps in between the leaps. that's part of the nature of Rahu, the node, is to connect things without connection between the intermittent steps. And then the sixth lord is very kind of problematic and critical as well. So this insight potentiality of the eighth house is highlighted by the fact that this sixth lord is also present here. So what you see here is that Mercury is in this eighth house with a Nij Bhanga yoga, which makes it kind of emulate an exaltation, in a Viparit Raj yoga because the eighth house is involved in a house exchange with the sixth. So it's a very, very powerful Pisces eighth house packed up with planets, including Mercury. And then outside of this eighth house, the only planet in a Kendra is his moon, who's exalted. So you can really see that there's going to be some kind of mental focus to this person. Mental, psychological, emotional focus to the person. So you can take what you see about his eighth house and make sure that you put it in the context that this is a moon dominant chart. It's not just an eighth house dominant chart, it's a moon dominant chart. So you're going to get the psychological or psychic effects from the eighth house. Now let's compare this with Osho's chart. Osho is the famous controversial cult guru, sex guru from the 70s. Also known, or originally known as Rajneesh. So his eighth house is not Pisces, his eighth house is Capricorn. It's not going to be the psychic thing, it's going to be more of a coldly logical thing. Because his Mercury is close to Venus, it's forming Raja Yoga. Because Mercury is the first lord and Venus is the fifth lord. So this is really highlighting this intelligence thing. So you have like a cold, calculating hyper-intelligence related to taboo and mystical things. His Mercury is surrounded by the 11th lord Mars and the 5th and 12th lord Venus. So look at that. As you know, the 8th house is a sexual house. Then Mercury is here, and on one side is the 11th lord, which is also a sexually relevant house because it's the house of pleasure. And on the other side is the 12th lord, which is also a sexually relevant house because it's the house of moksha, which is orgasm. And then the 12th lord is also the 5th lord, which is also a sexually relevant house because it's the house of children and love. And furthermore, those two planets, the 11th and 12th lord, they're Mars and Venus, the two components of sexuality. On top of that, the 3rd house and 7th house have Parivartana Yoga. So those are the two kama sthanas. Those are the two lust houses or the pleasure houses or sexual houses. So let's see him like this. There's this coldly calculating, very intellectual type of person who's amazingly hypersexual. That's what this 8th house is telling us. So that describes Osho to a T. And now let's finish up by taking a look at Berkowitz. Berkowitz was a satanic serial killer, I believe, some kind of very bad dude. Here's his 8th house. It's Gemini. That seems a little odd. So Mercury and Gemini should have a good dignity. But you see, it has a very strong conjunction with Mars. And Mars is, of course, angry and violent. Now you might say, well, Osho has conjunction with Mars too. It's not quite as close, but also, newsflash, Osho's organization was a terrorist group that tried to do biological warfare on an entire town. What's unique about Berkowitz is that his Mercury in the 8th house is bracketed by malefics. He has the Sun on one side and Mars on the other side. Osho doesn't have that. He has Venus on the other side. So he's not as obviously violent or angry as a person like Berkowitz. The context of the charts is interesting and important too. The context for Osho is that his ascendant is Gemini. So his context is intellectual. Whereas for Berkowitz, his ascendant is Scorpio, which is prone to anger. And it's not just any Scorpio ascendant, it's a Sunday ascendant, which means it's just on the border. So his ascendant is distressed. And then he has all this stuff happening in his 8th house. But the real thing for Berkowitz that you please, if you only pay attention to one thing, this is the one thing about criminals. His moon is exactly conjoined Rahu. This happens in 9 out of 10 cases of people who are seriously deranged. They have an extremely tight conjunction with moon and Rahu in a very prominent house, usually the 4th or the 10th. So that's the context in which he has Mercury in the 8th house, bracketed by malefics close to Mars. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. Let's talk about Mercury in the 9th house, and let's, as always, begin by understanding each one separately. So this is the 9th house. It is the area of sky that's above your head, but a bit towards the west. And that's what it symbolizes. Above our head symbolizes the way that we act in the physical world, and west symbolizes other people. So the 9th house, which is above our head and to the west, symbolizes how our actions affect other people. So this has to do with our values and our integrity. This is why it's the house of philosophy and other synonyms for the same basic thing like religion, ethics, morals, character. This is also why it is the house of education, because education is the process of acquiring philosophy. And therefore, it's also the house of educators, people that give us the education, that gives us the philosophy, etc. So this is why it has to do with teachers, gurus, guides, priests, elders. It's the house of good deeds because it's the house of how our actions affect other people. So it has to do with being responsible, being dutiful, and being generous or caring. And it's the house of good results or good luck, fortune, because good results come from good deeds. That's the 9th house. Now, how about Mercury? Mercury is basically the planet of intellect. Intellect has to do with codes and patterns. This is why Mercury is the planet of communication, because communication is transmission of information, and communication utilizes coded formats to transmit that information. So languages, words, or numbers, symbols. Mercury symbolizes the mastery of those things. Mercury symbolizes interaction between people and interactivity of things, because that's what communication is, right? So it has to do with our talent in exchanging, interacting, and trading. Mercury has to do with relationships, because communication, interaction equals relationships. So it has to deal with establishing partnerships, cooperations, and friendships. And Mercury is the planet of recreation because in relationships amongst peers, a lot of the times what we do is just have fun. So Mercury has to do with fun, wit, youthfulness, childishness, etc. Mercury symbolizes our ability to learn because learning is the recognition and understanding of patterns. Mercury symbolizes organization because organization means how clear you are with your patterns and how much you keep your things in good patterns. So Mercury is very neat and efficient. Mercury symbolizes symmetry because symmetry means balanced patterns. So Mercury has to do with balance and beauty, two effects of symmetry. Mercury symbolizes dexterity or expertise and talent, refinement, because it symbolizes balance, the ability to stand on a balanced position between two things and interact with the two sides of the things in a very dexterous way. Now that we remember what Mercury symbolizes and what the ninth house symbolizes, to understand Mercury in the ninth house is as easy as putting the two of those together and figuring out where their symbolisms form links. For example, Mercury symbolizes learning, and the ninth is the house of education. So Mercury in the ninth house is going to have to do with education and learning. Exactly what does it mean? You can kind of already figure that out, can't you? You can kind of intuit. It must mean something like good education, good learning, good intellect. So really these short seed forms of interpreting a planet in the house are really useful. But we'll also flesh them out a little bit more in a second. Let's first look at the other important thing about Mercury in the ninth house. The other way that Mercury and the ninth house link up. It's that Mercury is the planet of communication, and the ninth house is about educators. It might not be evident exactly how that's a link, but educators are the ones who are providing the information patterns. They're providing the patterns, and Mercury is the one that can receive the pattern and decode it and learn it. So this is a big link. Let's flesh out these two things right now. So just as you probably figured out, Mercury in the ninth house is good with learning things. So it actually has an attitude or a nature which is to seek knowledge and behave in such a way that it gains information. Mercury in the ninth house represents a person who likes to learn. They like words. They like communicating. They like talking and sharing ideas. They like going to places where ideas are discussed, like schools. They like reading books. They like talking about books. So they tend to be smart and educated. The other thing with communication and education also reinforces the same thing. These people are good at receiving information and classifying it, organizing it, putting it in the right patterns, learning it. They're good at learning a lot of stuff. And also, a very important thing about Mercury in the ninth house is that they're good with words. The link between the communicative nature of Mercury and the educational nature of the ninth house means they're good with transferring information. So they're good at showing things to people, explaining things to people, displaying things. So you will get a lot of really high quality performers with Mercury in the ninth house because they have a lot of talent in demonstrating something, and that's what a performer does. Now let's look at two charts that actually have Mercury in the ninth house. The first belongs to Tracy Lords. So Tracy Lords is a famous porn star. Is that what Mercury in the ninth house is all about? Not really, but she's a performer, right? And she's showing things and demonstrating things. And also she's pretty intellectual. But why is it that she's a porn star and not a librarian? Well, look at the context of the chart. Number one, K2 is very close to her ascendant in Libra. So So a person with Ketu close to their ascendant tends not to be typical. And in Libra, they tend to not be sensually typical. Opposite to this, in her 7th house, is debilitated Saturn. Very much opposite to that Ketu, and very much conjoined to Rahu. So it's quite obvious that the main thing about this chart, the really dominant thing in this chart, describes a person who is sexually non-conventional to an extreme. Besides this, she has the 3rd Lord in the 11th house, which is quite sensual. And she has the 11th Lord in the 8th house, which is quite sexual. And that 11th Lord is with Venus and the 7th Lord. So it's certainly quite sexual. So that's the whole context of this chart. In this context of a very sexually unusual person, here's Mercury in the 9th house. So you get a very smart, an unusually smart porn star. Another chart I'd like to look at with Mercury in the 9th house is Richard Pryor, the great comedian. It fits Mercury in the 9th house because he's a performer, and particularly he's very good with words. Comedians are extreme masters of language because comedy mostly rests upon the subtlety of words. So what made him a master of language as an entertainer, as a comedian? Well, his 1st Lord Jupiter joins his 11th Lord Saturn in the 3rd house, which is Taurus. Think about that. The 11th Lord is going to the 3rd house. The 3rd house is the place for writing. The 11th house is the place for art, pleasure, talent. So he's getting a lot of talent in writing by having the 11th Lord go to the 3rd house and having it become a big focus by very tightly joining the 1st Lord, who's also in the 3rd house, signifying that the main focus is communication. Furthermore, in that 3rd house, everything is being aspected by the 3rd Lord, who's Venus. And it's happening from the 9th house, which is auspicious, with the 9th Lord, which is auspicious. So you get a person that really understands what words to choose and what words to mix up and what words to put together and how to make things funny and how to say things in a way that people will accept and even laugh at instead of argue with. On top of that, his 5th Lord Moon is in the 11th house, so that means the 5th Lord is probably aspecting the 5th house, and the 5th Lord is in the house of arts. And his Mercury in the 9th house is in a Raja Yoga with Mars, making it very promote him to success, to be a key aspect of what promotes him to success. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. The newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. If you're interested in Mercury in the 10th house, then I suggest we start by understanding Mercury and the 10th house. So let's start with the 10th house. Here it is. It's the open sky, and that's the basis of everything that it symbolizes in astrology. For example, it symbolizes visibility, and that's why it's the house of the extroverse and the extroversive. So it has to do with the public, with society, with the visible world, and with the visible gender, the masculine gender. It's a masculine house. This in turn is why it's the house for fame, which means how visible you are. So it will reveal a lot about our status, our notoriety, and our career, the way in which we are visible in the world. In turn, this also implies how much influence we have in the world. If you have fame and notoriety and status, then you have some amount of influence and authority. Another root thing about the 10th house itself being the open sky, it's a windy place. So a lot of its symbolism has to do with that. For example, it's the house of action. Things are moving here in the wind. It's literally a house for movement or travel. And this means it's opposed to being settled or rooted or stabilized. So it's fairly unstable or destabilizing, and it tends to disperse things. With this summary of the 10th house, we'll be able to interpret Mercury in it. But first, we need to brush up on what Mercury symbolizes. Mercury is basically the symbol for intellect. Intellect deals with codes and patterns. So, for example, it deals with communication because communication has to do with sending and receiving codes. And what are those codes? Languages, words, numbers, maths. Mercury has to do with interaction between people because that's the ramification of communication. So all forms of interaction, including the exchange of things and the exchange of goods or commerce and trade. Mercury symbolizes relationships because that's what happens when you interact with people. So especially partnerships and friendships. Mercury also has to do with recreation because that's the nature of friendship. It's recreational, so Mercury has a lot of recreational assets, like it's fun, it's witty, it's youthful. Mercury also symbolizes learning, of course, because that's intellect, right? What does learning really mean? It means the digestion of patterns, the recognition of patterns. So our ability to recognize things and understand new information. Mercury represents organization, because organization is nothing but keeping your patterns in order or keeping things in efficient patterns, so being neat. Mercury therefore has to do with symmetry, because if you're organized and you keep your patterns in order, then they're probably symmetrical patterns, they're probably balanced. And thus Mercury has a lot to do with beauty, because a lot of beauty is based on balance and symmetry. Finally, Mercury signifies our dexterity as a result of being very balanced. So it's in a position where it's able to really act efficiently and effectively and with expertise. Now, in order to understand Mercury in the 10th house, just take the symbolisms of Mercury and put them next to the symbolisms of the 10th house, and then just ask yourself, where do these things connect? And in what way do they connect, positively or negatively? For example, Mercury is communication, and the 10th house is extroversive. So there's a connection there between language and extroversion, communication and extroversion. That is an important clue, an important seed to understanding what Mercury represents in the 10th house. It has something to do with communication and extroversion. We'll explore that in a second, but let's look for some other clues first. For example, Mercury is all about interaction, and the 10th house is all about action. So this is another thing that we need to contemplate to be able to understand what Mercury in the 10th house really says. And the third thing is, Mercury has to do with balance, but the 10th house has to do with instability. So maybe there's some kind of a clash going on here. So now that we've identified these clues or these seeds about what Mercury in the 10th house really says to us, let's talk to these seeds. Let's grow these seeds and see what they're actually saying. Let's start with Mercury being communicative and the 10th house being extroversive. What does that really mean? It means that Mercury in the 10th house is really good with communicating. But in what sort of way? It's the 10th house is extroversive and disclosing of information. So Mercury in the 10th house is very good at disclosing, exposing, divulging, displaying, and revealing. That's where its expertise in communication and interaction lies. Things which would be difficult for an ordinary person to express or show are easier for a person with Mercury in the 10th house to reveal and display. Now let's think about the second thing. Mercury has to do with interaction and the 10th house has to do with action. So this indicates effective interaction. Now that reinforces the ability to communicate well, because if you can communicate well, it means you interact effectively. So really, Mercury in the 10th house is expressive or disclosive, very effectively disclosive or revealing. Additionally, interact effectively also means they're expert. They have expertise in how they deal with things. They know how things work. So they have dexterity and expertise in their actions as well as in their words. So the first theme really is about how well Mercury in the 10th house discloses and reveals. The second theme is additionally about how much dexterity and expertise they have in their movements or actions or career. Then the third thing, which was maybe a clash, right? Mercury has to do with balance, but the 10th house has to do with instability. So what is this really saying about Mercury in the 10th house? Well, before we go too far with this, I'd like to remind you that Mercury has to do with balance, but this use of the word balance is not really synonymous with the word stability. Because Mercury is a very light planet. It's a very nimble planet. So Mercury's balance is not really achieved by its heaviness or its stability. It's achieved by its ability to go on both sides of the fence at the same time. So it's not really clashing with the instability of the 10th house. But we'll still find a trace of a clash here, to the effect that Mercury in the 10th house indicates a kind of tendency to extremism. Or what we can more generally say is that Mercury in the 10th house achieves balance by spreading itself out. So it may go extremely to one side of an issue to achieve balance on an issue that's imbalanced. Or it may explore very opposite ends of issues and therefore have extremity but achieving its balance through this diversion to the extremes. And so this ability to be spread out on different sides of an issue also aids in the basic nature of Mercury in the 10th house, which is to be communicative or revealing. So these are the ideas that I want to share with you about what Mercury in the 10th house is really saying to us. This is astrological theory. The way it goes into practice has to be modified based on the chart that you're dealing with, because there you'll find Mercury in the 10th house in all different kinds of contexts. So let's take a look at several charts now that have Mercury in the 10th house and talk about the kind of individual that actually had this chart. So who are these people that we could look at? Well, two very powerful speakers, Martin Luther King Jr. and Benito Mussolini. So let's look at those two charts. And then also we have three really significant authors or thinkers. Helen Keller, that would be a very interesting one. Prabhupada, and Einstein. Then also let's look at 3 artists: Van Gogh, Raquel Welch, and Mata Hari, who is an artist/spy. But let's start with Martin Luther King. Why is he such a superb speaker? Of course, that's part of what's latent in Mercury in the 10th house, but not everybody with Mercury in the 10th house is going to be as great of an orator as Martin Luther King. So what is it about him? Well, first of all, in the first house, he has Jupiter. Jupiter is an oratory planet that influences the quality or the impressiveness of the voice. And Jupiter is in his first house in Taurus. So it's really becoming an attractive or compelling voice. In addition to that, his Mercury is his second lord, and the second house also directly influences how you speak. So if Mercury is in Aquarius in the 10th house, then it's the second lord in the 10th house. So in that case, the communication as an orator and speaker would really be highlighted. Furthermore, he has his first lord exalted in the 11th house. So it indicates that he has some finesse or taste. And also, since the first lord is exalted, it indicates that he has a lot of renown, or he gets noticed. So if you combine having a lot of sense of taste with being able to communicate really well and having an appealing voice, then you can see the recipe is there for an amazing orator. Similarly with that, also in his 11th house is the third lord, which the third lord in the 11th house indicates eloquence. Let's take a look now at Benito Mussolini. Similarly, a very great orator, but very macho and violent. So like Martin Luther, he has something very significant going on with his Jupiter. His Jupiter is his second lord and is exalted in the 9th house. And on top of that, it's with Venus, who is the 7th lord, which aids in his ability to interact with others through speech. So there's the context of a chart that's already really stellarly disposed to being a very influential speaker. And in that context, he has Mercury in the 10th house. As for his other qualities, well, his Mercury is his 8th lord, and it's exactly conjoined the sun in the sun's sign. So there's a lot of macho-ness. Also, he's just a very 8th housey person in general, and a kind of a malefic person in general. Because not only does he have a malefic sign ascending, but he's got his moon surrounded by malefics in the 8th house. And his first lord is also in the 8th house. Now let's move on to the authors. Helen Keller, a great thinker, a great author, but also deaf and blind. So you'll notice her Mercury is barely in the 10th house. It's literally at 0 degrees of Leo. Her 10th. So that is not only Bhava Sandhi, but that's Gandanta Sandhi. Bhava Sandhi means it's on the border of its place. It's on the border of its sign. And Gandanta Sandhi means it's on the border between water and fire, which is the most difficult of all the borders. So having Mercury Gandanta is an indicator for the potential of neural problems. She has debilitated Saturn in her 6th house with her second lord. So that really shows health problems. And then this Saturn here, debilitated in her 6th house, affects her hearing and her vision directly. For hearing, it affects the 3rd lord and the 3rd house very strongly. And for vision, it affects the 12th house and the 2nd lord very strongly. On top of that, her Sun and her Venus are very close to Ketu. Now let's have a look at Prabhupada. There you can see his Mercury in the 10th house. Why is he so religious? He's a religious author. Well, his Mercury is his 9th lord. And also the really striking thing about this particular chart is the 12th lord Jupiter in the 8th house, exactly with Ketu.
So that's a very spiritually intense signifier. Now, how about Einstein? Einstein is an extremely intelligent thinker and scientist, but also one of the most important things about him was his communication skills. So there's his Mercury in the 10th house explaining that he's able to disclose difficult information. And sure enough, his Mercury here is Vargotama, which makes it as if it was in its own sign. And then it's with Saturn. So Mercury plus Saturn is with Saturn very closely. Mercury plus Saturn is for science and logic. Furthermore, his real signature for intellect is the exaltation of his fifth lord, which is also forming Raja Yoga via Parivartana with that debilitated Saturn, saving it from that debilitation by Nichapanga principle. Now let's move on to the artist. This is another sense of being able to express well and disclose well and reveal, communicate, to express yourself. Here's Vincent van Gogh, one of the most famous artists. So his Mercury is his third lord. So that's giving skill, and it's also particularly giving manual talents. The real kicker in his chart, the real signature in his chart is his Venus. It's like incredible. His Venus is his 11th lord, which is already kind of significant because Venus and the 11th house both have to do with artistic skill. Now, that Venus 11th lord is exalted and Vargotama and in Raja Yoga because of his joining with Mars, which is the 5th and the 10th lord. And furthermore, in its Vargotama placement in the Navamsha, it's in the 3rd house, the house of manual dexterity. So in this context, Mercury is giving this very ability to communicate well and reveal things. Really, his paintings are revealing the essence of what he sees in something. The color, it's not really accurate painting. It's very ideological and communicative and essential painting. Now, Raquel Welch, who's basically a sex symbol, really. Well, that's another implication of revealing what's usually hidden, showing things that are considered taboo. Her Mercury is her 10th lord in the 10th house. So that's a strong indicator of personal fame, high visibility. Furthermore, it's exalted. Furthermore, it's in Raja Yoga because it's combining with the 9th lord, the sun. And furthermore, it is with both of the trine lords, the 5th lord and the 9th lord, and it's aspected by the other trine lord, the 1st lord. So it's extremely blessed with prosperity, so that's why she's very beautiful, and it's extremely famous here in the 10th house. So it's actually giving her the ability to be disclosed and shown. Finally, this very interesting person, Matahari. She's also a sex symbol, but she's also a famous spy, so she's all involved in espionage. So in her case, Mercury is the 11th lord, and it's with the 1st lord in the 10th house. So like Raquel Welch, but to a smaller degree, it's showing personal disclosure, showing her own self, showing her own body, and personal fame and notoriety. But the espionage thing is really evident from looking at the nakshatras. Because there all of a sudden we see Mercury, Sun, and Mars, all three of them are in Ashlesha, which is the nakshatra for seduction and espionage. And on top of that, it's supported by her having a Scorpio ascendant. So now you can see how this basic nature of Mercury in the 10th house takes various forms and facets. Different facets of it become highlighted depending on the circumstances of that Mercury in the 10th house and the circumstances of the whole chart. So it's like a seed form of an interpretation that grows in different ways depending on what soil it's planted in.
If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tara Habala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.
To understand Mercury in the 11th house, let's start by understanding Mercury and the 11th house. So let's start with the 11th house. Here it is. Physically, it's the eastern side of the overhead sky. And since the overhead sky represents the public and the eastern sky represents the self, the 11th house represents the way the public benefits us. For example, we get access to society. So the 11th house signifies community, contacts, and networks. The 11th house represents socializing with those networks. And so it's a friendly house, and it has to do with that kind of social friendship. The 11th house also has to do with exchanging things with people. And thus it has to do with gaining and getting income and profiting. Society also gives us culture. So the 11th house has to do with arts and entertainment. It also has to do with the ability to produce art and the ability to enjoy art. So it has to do with talent and refinement. Finally, the 11th house represents enjoyment or pleasure. Now that we understand the 11th house, let's understand Mercury, and then we'll be ready to understand Mercury in the 11th house. Mercury is the planet of intellect, so it has to do with communication. Communication enables interaction. Interaction enables relationships. And relationships enable enjoyment, relaxation, and so forth. Intellect isn't just about giving out information, it's also about taking in information. So it's not only about communication, it's also about learning. The more information you take in, the more careful you have to be how you store it. So Mercury has to do with organization. The more carefully you store things, the more symmetrical or balanced you become. And the more balanced you are, the more able you are to act with refinement and dexterity. So Mercury represents dexterity. Now that we've understood Mercury and the 11th house, we can put them together. All we have to do is literally put the symbolisms together side by side and see where they're on the same page. For example, Mercury symbolizes interaction, and the 11th house symbolizes socializing. So Mercury in the 11th house is going to be all about that. Mercury symbolizes expertise, and the 11th house symbolizes talent. So that describes Mercury in the 11th house. Mercury is all about recreation or enjoyment, and so is the 11th house. So that's another theme of Mercury in the 11th. And finally, Mercury symbolizes trade and exchange, and so does the 11th house. So that's your fourth theme. Let's unpack these a little bit more. If the planet of interaction is in the house of socializing and interaction, what do you think that means? that symbolizes being very well connected, having a lot of contacts, having good contacts. If the planet of expertise is in the house of talent, what do you think that means? It means talent, having expertise, having talent, having skill, being artistic, being communicative, being expressive, being intelligent. If the planet of recreation is in the house of pleasure, what do you think that means? That means the person is pleasant. They are good at relaxing. They're good at helping other people relax. They're enjoyable. They're entertaining. They're pleasurable. And finally, if the planet of trade and exchange is in the house of trade and exchange, what do you think that means? They're not poor. They're wealthy. Or they're effective at exchanging things, so that also means they're an effective communicator. Now we understand the abstract of what Mercury in the 11th house represents by itself, outside of the context of a chart. Let's look at 5 famous people who have Mercury in the 11th house so that we can see how this abstract will work in specific contexts. First, let's look at Will Ferrell. He's, in fact, very well networked. You have to be to work in LA. He's very talented. He's very pleasant, entertaining, enjoyable. He's very funny. And he's very wealthy, and he's very good at communication and words. So why is he such a good match for what we expected from Mercury in the 11th house? Because he doesn't really have anything that contradicts it in the context of the rest of his chart. And Mercury in his 11th house is a prominent thing for him, primarily because Mercury is his first lord. And by the way, his ascendant is in Purva Phalguni, which is also very entertaining and pleasurable. Secondly, Mercury is his 10th lord as well. So it would be a very visible thing about him. It would be part of his career, all the things associated with Mercury in the 11th house. In addition, his 11th lord is in the 3rd house, so this strengthens artistic and talent because the 3rd house is also very important for skill and talent. And finally, Venus is in the 1st house. That will help. But also what's particularly interesting about this is his Venus is in the 11th house from his moon. Another famous person with Mercury in the 11th house is the great Salvador Dali. Another great artist. Why? Well, his Mercury is his 3rd lord. So again, the 3rd house combining with the 11th house. And his 3rd lord, Mercury, is joined very closely to Mars, within 2 degrees of Mars. And Mars is his 5th lord and his 10th lord as well. So it's his Yoga Karaka planet and it's his 5th lord. So now you're joining the 3rd with the 5th in the 11th. And that is the most common recipe for significantly talented artists. Furthermore, it's in Taurus 11th house with the 11th lord Venus. He has something that I would call a bracketing Raja Yoga because Mars on the one side of this stellium in his 11th house is the 5th lord, the lord of a trine, and Venus on the other end of it is the lord of a Kendra, an angle, the 4th house. Furthermore, look at his 11th house from his moon. The 11th house from his moon is Aquarius, and it has its own lord in it. Another famous individual with Mercury in the 11th house is Agatha Christie. Mercury is her 10th lord, so again, it will be visible in her. It's also very bright. It's very far from the sun. It's almost at its maximum distance from the sun. And like Salvador Dali, it's in a Venus sign in the 11th house. Furthermore, her 1st lord is in the 3rd house, while her 3rd lord is in the 10th house with the sun. So 10th lord in the 11th house, while the 3rd lord is in the 10th house, shows a career that's involved in arts, And particularly, it's third house heavy, because the first lord is in the third and the third is in the 10th. So it's more about writing than it is about performance in her case. There's also a big influence from her third lord to her 11th lord, because Saturn is exactly aspecting the 11th lord. But she's not like a performing artist or visual artist. She's more hidden. In fact, she was very hidden. So that has to do with Venus being in the 12th, and also her 11th house from the moon as its lord in the 12th. A fourth famous person with Mercury in the 11th is Marilyn. Well, her Mercury is her 11th lord, and it's with the first lord. So this is very performancey, this is very showy, this is very personally being the entertaining thing. Why is she a sex symbol entertainer? It's because her ascendant is very strongly aspected by the moon. So it's very beautiful. Meanwhile, her first lord, the sun, is in Gemini, the 11th house, with the 11th lord, Mercury. So it's very symmetrical, balanced, etc. But the main thing really with Marilyn is sex appeal. So that has to do with the influence from the moon to the ascendant, while the moon is the 12th lord, and it is joined to the 8th lord, Jupiter. And of course, it doesn't hurt that her Venus is in Aries. Finally, let's look at somebody who doesn't seem to really fit the picture of Mercury in the 11th house, Lucky Luciano, the gangster. So in his case, Mercury is not the first or the third or the 10th lord, it's the 8th lord. The very interesting thing about Luciano is the malefics are all ganged up on both his first lord and his moon, and also his sun. So all of the three primary personal points are completely malefically dominated. His first lord is Saturn, and it's with the other malefics, the sun and Mars. And furthermore, this moon is malefic because it's empty, and this Mercury is malefic because it's with the sun and Mars. Then if you look at it from the moon's point of view, it's with all three natural malefics, Saturn, Sun, and Mars, and it's with the temporary malefic, Mercury, who's malefic by association. And then if you look at it as the sun, it's bracketed by the two natural malefics, Saturn and Mars, and it's with the temporary malefics, Moon and Mercury. So this, yes, he has Mercury in the 11th house, but the really outstanding thing here is the maleficence in this chart. Furthermore, all of his planets are clumped into 3 signs, which is called Shula Yoga, which indicates a fighting kind of personality. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. Let's talk about Mercury in the 12th house, also in all 12 zodiac signs. So Mercury in the 12th in Aries, Mercury in the 12th in Taurus, Mercury in the 12th in Gemini, etc. Let's start with a review of the 12th house. What is it? It's the part of the sky that is right above the eastern horizon. So it represents the wind and the rain and the weather that erodes or evaporates things from the eastern horizon. So the eastern horizon symbolizes the sunrise or visibility. And that's why the 12th house is all about things that are detract from visibility. So it's the house of invisibility and invisible things. That means abstract things, unreal things, fantasy things, spiritual things, psychological things. This is why it's a house of the unknown, because the things we can't see, they're difficult to know about. So it has to do with alien things, foreign things, confusing things. And it's the house of decline, because it's like the erosion, the evaporation of things. So it has to do with expense, loss of money, loss of energy. The sunrise also symbolizes the appearance of the self, because the sun symbolizes the self. And so since the 12th house is above the sunrise or eroding the sunrise, it symbolizes reduction of self. So it's the house of humility, where the self becomes less visible. So it also has to do with isolation or alienation. It's the house of enemies or people who subtract from you. So it has to do with detractors and critics. And it's the house of weakness, losing your own strength. So it has to do with fatigue or retirement or retiring from an endeavor, giving up on things. That's the 12th house. Now, to understand Mercury in the 12th house, let's take a step forward and review what Mercury represents. Mercury is the planet of intellect, and intellect has to do with codes. This is why Mercury symbolizes communication, the ability to put information into codes that are transmissible. So it has to do with languages, maths, and any kind of symbolic system. Mercury is the planet of interaction, because that's what you do with these symbols, you exchange them. Mercury is the planet of relationship, because the people that you interact with are the ones you establish relationships with. So it has to do with friendship and partnership. And Mercury is the planet of recreation, because that's what happens in friendships. So Mercury is a recreational planet, and it therefore has a character of being witty, funny, fun, youthful. Intellect also has to do with recognizing patterns. So Mercury is a planet for learning, the ability to decode something. Mercury is the planet of organization, because organization means how well you store your patterns and how well you deal with patterns and how well you put things in patterns. So Mercury has to do with efficiency and neatness, because it's the planet of organization. It's also the planet of symmetry, because that's basically what organization is, a balance between things. So it has to do with balance, symmetry, and therefore beauty. And dexterity, because dexterity is a result of balance. And so Mercury is a very expert or delicate or refined planet. Now that we've reviewed the 12th house and Mercury, we're ready to take the next step and ask ourselves, what does Mercury look like when it's in the 12th house? To do that step, all you need to do is take Mercury symbolisms and put them next to the 12th house symbolisms and see where they connect. For example, Mercury represents friendships, but the 12th house represents enemies. Mercury represents interaction, but the 12th house represents isolation. Mercury represents learning, but the 12th house represents the unknown. And Mercury represents youth, but the 12th house represents fatigue and retirement and old age. So now what we want to do is unpack these seeds of the interpretation to see what they look like theoretically for Mercury in the 12th house. And then we'll take a further step and ask, what if this 12th house is Aries? Or what if it's Taurus? So first, let's unpack these seeds. So Mercury symbolizes friendship and the 12th house symbolizes enemies. So what does that mean? That means the person with Mercury in the 12th house tends to be, let's say, unfriended or non-integrated. They have some challenges in how well they relate to the people around them. they have some challenges in dealing with friends and partnerships. Mercury represents interaction. The 12th house represents isolation. So what does that mean? It means the person is not really efficient. So they will tend to make mistakes or blunder things, falter in what they're doing. So far it doesn't sound so great, does it? Well, no, it's the 12th house, so what do you expect? Planets don't tend to do well in the 12th house. But don't forget, we're going to look at Mercury in each particular sign in the 12th house. And we'll look at some people who actually have Mercury in the 12th house. And we'll see how this theoretical interpretation actually plays out in 12 actual cases. So to continue, Mercury has to do with learning, and the 12th house has to do with the unknown. So this symbolizes an inability to learn, or a lack of interest in learning, or an uneducated nature, or a type of knowledge which is not particularly practical, some highly theoretical or highly abstract knowledge. Mercury represents youth, and the 12th house represents fatigue or old age. So Mercury in the 12th house is sort of lethargic or lazy, in that they tend to rely on other people. So again, it's not so, rosy looking, Mercury in the 12th house, but no planet in the 12th house is particularly rosy looking. And that's just one of the paints that the artist of the astrological chart is supplying. You have to mix all these paints on the whole canvas of the whole chart to understand what it means. So let's do that next. Let's take a look at Mercury in Aries in the 12th house. So what happens here is now Mercury is the second lord and the fifth lord. And these two houses are both intelligent houses and knowledgeable houses. So Mercury in this ascendant, in this Taurus ascendant, being in Aries in the 12th house, is very smart. So it will be very more resistant to the implication of Mercury in the 12th house lacking education. It will be more likely that it is theoretical knowledge or abstract knowledge. So in fact, we would interpret it like that. Intellect is abstract and conceptual, not so practical, but it's bold at the same time and different and kind of in the vanguard or unique. So these are unique theoretical thinkers. For example, have a look at Immanuel Kant, a very, very important theologian and philosopher and thinker. So I don't want to make the video 12 hours long. So you could just look at the bullet points to see what the salient features in his chart that really prevent Mercury in the 12th house from implying a lack of intelligence. So real quickly, his third and his fifth lords join. His first lord is in the second, Gemini. His Jupiter is in the 10th. His ninth lord is in the 9th. And his 12th house is in exchange with the third. Now let's look at Mercury in Taurus, 12th house. So in this case, the ascendant is Gemini. So Mercury is the first and the fourth lord. Being the first lord, it has a lot to do with practicality. But being the fourth lord has a lot to do with theoretical things. And so Gemini, by its nature, is kind of in this dualistic state between tangible and intangible, mind and body, practical and impractical. So that's going to be exacerbated by Mercury being in Taurus, the 12th house. So we would describe this as intellect, which is impractical but fertile. So putting that together, it would mean Mercury in Taurus, 12th house is particularly imaginative. For example, Orson Welles. And you can check all these bullet points to see why he's so creative and so imaginative. For example, his 5th and his 11th lords join in the 11th house. His Jupiter is in the 12th house in Pisces. His 9th lord is in the 1st in Gemini. And by the way, he's really well known for having a big resonant voice. So his Jupiter is aspecting his 2nd house exactly from Pisces, while the 2nd lord is in the 9th house and Mercury is in Taurus. Now let's look into Mercury in Gemini in the 12th house. So this would be for Cancer ascendants. In this case, Mercury becomes the 3rd and the 12th lord. So it's going to be domicile here in the 12th house. So none of the negative permutations are particularly likely anymore, especially lethargic is less likely because it's the 3rd lord. So we're going to have an active intellect, but one which is fantastical or fantasy-oriented, yet quite articulate. For example, Angelina Jolie has Mercury in the 12th house in Gemini. An actress, a very articulate yet fantasy-oriented person. And you can check the bullet points to see what it is about this specific chart that really brings that all the way out. 5th and 11th lords join in the 11th house. Her Mars is great. That's particularly why she's very energetic. And why she's so beautiful and well known as kind of a sex symbol. Well, Venus, the 11th lord, is right on the ascendant with a Pisces Navamsha. Now, how about Mercury in Cancer in the 12th house? This would be for Leo ascendant. So in this case, Mercury becomes the 2nd and the 11th lord. So this has to do with education and also friendships, especially friendships. And it's for a Leo ascendant where the people tend to be, therefore, as a result of Leo rising, kind of self-oriented. So this Mercury in the 12th house particularly highlights the social challenges and kind of also puts a highlight on the educational challenges of Mercury in the 12th. So Mercury in 12th house Cancer is very opinionated in its intellect and its opinions of things. And its decision-making process is very influenced by its opinions. Yet it's not so easy for this person to articulate their opinions in a way that others can predict, understand, anticipate. So the interaction with each other, with other people, becomes very challenging. A good example of Mercury in the 12th house in Cancer is Donald Trump. Really confrontational in his highly opinionated speech. Also, not a great businessman. A failure in business who just has a lot of money to fail with, but who actually became more successful, not as a businessman, but as a personality. So in his case, his Leo and Mars ascending really highlight the selfish nature, and the self-strength, the ability to become famous for who he is. Now let's take a look at Mercury and Leo in the 12th house. Now this is for the Virgo ascendant. So again, Mercury is the 1st lord, and now it's the 10th lord. So this is also going to highlight the social challenges that Mercury is implicated in by being in the 12th house. So it's a sense here, Mercury in Leo is a sense of, I don't belong with these people. I'm an alien. The intellect, therefore, is going to be exotic and self-developed. An example of somebody with Mercury in the 12th house Leo is Ernest Hemingway. And now he has Mars in the 1st, so his I don't belong with these people kind of translates into I am me. I am me. I am not my group. Why is he such a great writer? It's really because of his 3rd lord being in the 1st, 11th lord being in the 5th, and the 9th lord Venus being in the 11th. Now let's have a look at Mercury in Virgo, the 12th house. So now, again, Mercury is domicile as the 12th lord and also as the 9th lord. So this makes it a little bit more risky to the uneducated potential of Mercury in the 12th house, but it fortifies the sense of morality or goodness. So here we would say this intellect is humble, but it's prudent and thorough. So it's quiet but patient intellect. An example of somebody with Mercury in the 12th house of Virgo is Jimmy Carter. Now, why was he the president of the United States? There's a lot of things in his chart. So first of all, his 1st lord and his 11th lord exchange for Neech Punga. So that makes a very strong self. Then he has 3 really important Raja Yogas, 10th Lord Moon and 5th Lord Saturn joined for Raja Yoga, 7th Lord Mars is with Ketu in the 5th for a second Raja Yoga, and the 5th and 2nd exchange for a Raja Yoga. Now, how about Mercury in Libra in the 12th house? So now Mercury is the 8th lord and the 11th lord. So for a Scorpio ascendant, Mercury has a sexual flavor to it because of being both the 11th and the 8th lord. That's why Scorpio is known as a sexy sign, because its intellect is disposed towards that. What that does by putting Mercury now in the 12th means that sexuality becomes a bit challenging. The intellect itself is quite abstract, yet it's refined or artistic. An example of somebody with Mercury in Libra 12th house is Caitlyn/Bruce Jenner. And so the sexual challenges inherent here get highlighted particularly for this individual because Mercury is very, very close to Ketu. And also this is a very successful individual, and that's because the first Lord Mars is with the 4th Lord Saturn in the 11th house. How about Mercury in Scorpio 12th house? Now Mercury is the 10th and 7th Lord. So there's a synergy going on here with the movement houses and the foreign houses, 12, 7, 10. So Mercury in Scorpio 12th house inclines a person to be very international. The intellect, again, is going to be fantastical in a mysterious way or mystical way. An example of such a person is Joe Biden. So his Mercury in the 12th house in Scorpio joins the 5th Lord and 12th Lord Mars and the 4th Lord. So it's creating a lot of Raja Yogas, and it's with the domicile planet. So he's not uneducated, but he doesn't come across as particularly articulate or educated, does he? In addition, he has a Viparit Raja Yoga as well, by the 6th Lord, Venus being in the 12th house, so that indicates he's not easy to defeat. But most of all, his 1st Lord Jupiter is exalted, and it aspects those 4 planets in the 12th house. And its Lord, the Moon, is also exalted. So he's a very prominent, very, very prominent individual. Now let's have a look at Mercury in Sagittarius in the 12th house. Now Mercury is the 9th and the 6th Lord. So it's going to be less lethargic and more aggressive. The intellect will be abstract yet ambitious. An example of this is Billie Jean King. Billie Jean King also has Uttarashada ascending, so these people tend to be indomitable. She has the 4th Lord Mars with the 1st Lord Saturn in Raja Yoga in the 6th house for athletics and competitiveness, and opposite the 6th Lord Mercury. And she has the 5th and 10th Lord Venus with the 7th Lord Moon in the 10th house. How about Mercury in Capricorn in the 12th house? Now this Mercury is the 5th and 8th Lord. So again, this, like when Mercury is the 8th and 11th, when it's the 8th and the 5th, it also has a sexuality to it. So it being in the 12th house is going to highlight the interaction issues in a sexual way, especially because Aquarius is the ascendant. So it'll be like the person can't interact with anybody in a way that isn't at least subliminally sexual. And the impracticality of Mercury in the 12th house tends to become more mysterious or mystical because now Mercury is the 8th Lord and the 5th Lord. So they don't seem unintelligent, but they seem mystifying or incomprehensible. So you get an intellect which is mystifying or mystical, but it's tangible or definite. So it's expressing itself, but it's expressing such mysterious things. An example is Jim Morrison. So he's particularly wordy and particularly intellectual. The 1st Lord Saturn plus the 10th Lord Mars both in the 5th house, while Jupiter aspects the ascendant. 5th and 12th houses exchange. The moon is exalted, the 7th and the 11th houses also exchange, and the 3rd lord is in the 5th house aspecting the 11th. And just to top off his mysteriousness and make the mystique be a very obvious thing about him, is Ketu is ascending. Mercury in Aquarius in the 12th house. Now Mercury is the 4th and 7th. Again, this has to do with being more international, but it's a little bit like conflicted in the nationality, the patriotism, and the conflicted in the allegiances, political allegiances. Yet more capable with abstract things, because that's something that 7 and 4 have in common. So this Mercury in the 12th house is not likely to be uneducated at all. It's very likely to be very abstract in its thinking. Yet, because it's in Aquarius, it's very syncretic. So it's syncretically abstract. An example of such a person who might not really be well known to many people is Hans Georg Gadamer, who is an important philosopher for hermeneutics, or the way that language supplies meaning and how to derive meaning from language. It's not just that his Mercury in the 12th is in Aquarius. There's many things in this chart which make this person outstandingly intelligent. Exalted Venus, domicile Saturn, domicile Jupiter, and domicile Moon, for example. Finally, let's wrap it up by looking at Mercury in the 12th sign, Pisces, in the 12th house. So this is for an Aries ascendant. Mercury now is the 3rd and the 6th lords. So it has a lot to do with the drives, but it's in Pisces, so it's debilitated. So it's more likely to indicate this lethargy. And the intellect here, however, is very fantastical and imaginative again. So an example of somebody with Mercury in Pisces 12th house is Ron Howard. He's particularly successful with Mercury in the 12th house Pisces because his 3rd and his 12th houses are in exchange, while his 1st lord Mars is in the Sagittarius 9th house. Let's look how much fire there is. And the 1st lord is Mars in Sagittarius, and his Mercury is right in the heart of the sun. So he's very fire infused. So the potential of lethargy for Mercury in the 12th house Pisces is diminished, which leaves the potential for fertile imagination. And that indeed is what comes through for him, especially with his moon being very close to Rahu.
If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.